Hello everyone, welcome back to AMH 2020, U.S. Introductory History Survey since 1877. This video is going to be a little bit different than previous lectures I've made. It's going to be more of a transitional video. I'm going to be speaking in broader terms about the 1990s, the 2000s, the period that's often referred to as America in the millennium, around the close of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century. And there are many historical through lines between the past and the present during this period. We'll talk a little bit about events in the 21st century. We'll talk about things like the War on Terror. But when you're talking about historical events that have happened within the last 20 years, it's a little bit more difficult because you don't have as much historical scholarship to build upon. Because history is not just about studying primary sources and actors and events and developments in the past. It's also about studying what other scholars and historians have said. And when you get into what is often called contemporary history, events within the last 20 or so years, it can be more difficult. Making predictions, finding trends, showing change over time can be much more of a challenge because you're just dealing with a more punctuated time period. That being said, it's the year 2025 as of this recording. The 21st century is a quarter of the way over. And as of 2025, we are 80 years from the end of World War II, which ended in 1945. But in 1945, at the end of World War II, they were actually 80 years away from 1865, the end of the American Civil War. In these two 80-year periods, 1865 to 1945, America changed significantly, especially in terms of technological and mechanical developments and inventions. And then from 1945 to 2025, America also changed significantly technologically. We entered the atomic age. We put a man on the moon, but our biggest technological revolutions in that second 80-year period from 1945 to the present have been largely in computing technology. It's been what one technological investor named Peter Thiel called a bits and bytes revolution. So there's been a lot of change, and it can be very difficult to chart these changes. There's also the idea of social lag as well. Social lag, or sometimes it's called cultural lag, is a term used by historians and other academics to describe when society changes very rapidly technologically or economically, but social beliefs don't change as quickly. And you definitely see that in American history. I think you really see it in that first 80-year period from 1865 to 1945. You still have social lag as well in the 1945 to the present period, but in some ways there's less social lag because of mass media and because of computing technology, because of the internet, and because of the information revolution that takes place in the 1945 to 2025 period. So those are some big trends you can think about as you're considering the late 21st century and early 21st century in America. And so here are some of the things we're going to talk about in this video. We'll talk about the presidency of George H.W. Bush to begin, areas where he was very similar to Ronald Reagan, as well as areas where he was a little bit different as well. We'll talk about the first Gulf War in the early 1990s that will eventually be followed by the U.S.-Iraq War that begins in earnest in 2003. We'll talk about the continued decline and fall of the Soviet Union as well that's taking place during this period. Then we'll talk about the 1992 election. We'll talk about Bill Clinton and the Clintonian approach and how Clinton supported many liberal policies, but he often used very conservative language and what you might call conservative cultural coding in order to get these liberal policies realized. And this is a period of political realignment. The sixth party system is in full swing. But Clinton was able to reach a variety of voters and really create his own political coalition that cut across ideological lines and regional lines. And you see this in his policies as well. He supported many liberal policies, but he also supported some conservative policies as well. And Clinton's presidency was much more focused on domestic policy, but there were some important foreign policy developments during his presidency, which would have significant implications for the 21st century as well. And of course, you can't talk about Bill Clinton without talking about his impeachment. It would be like talking about Richard Nixon and not talking about Watergate. We'll talk about the 2000 election, the controversy, the Bush v. Gore case, and of course we'll talk about the Bush presidency. More we'll talk about foreign policy than domestic policy, but domestic and foreign policy actually were linked in the War on Terror, which would have implications internationally across the world, but also for the American people at home. And we'll talk about American culture in the 90s and 2000s at this sort of turn of the century, turn of the millennium period, changing technology and changing values, the impact of the War on Terror, and we'll also talk about some other trends. Dissatisfaction with neoconservative foreign policy and neoliberal economic policy, policies that had been emerging in the late 20th century that began to be rejected by the American electorate towards the end of the 2010s. And dissatisfaction with neoliberalism and neoconservatism, it fuels populist movements on both the political right and the political left, leading to the rise of more polarizing political figures such as Bernie Sanders and, more famously, Donald Trump. And I'm not going to talk as much about presidential elections and things like that in this lecture, because this is meant to be more of a transitional video. We're talking about bigger trends here, but I'm talking about the rise of these populist movements. I'll talk about dissatisfaction with neoliberalism and neoconservatism and what that means for everyday Americans, whether they're Gen X that are becoming, older, mature adults in this period, the rising millennial generation, and then Generation Z, which will begin to come of age in the 2020s. And of course, it wouldn't be an academic lecture without a obligatory, perfunctory discussion of AI as well. And so I'll do that towards the end of the video. To begin, the USSR is collapsing at the beginning of the 1990s, and really it had been showing signs of collapse for decades before its final dissolution in 1991. And not only was the Soviet Union itself collapsing, but its satellite states were breaking away. Its Warsaw Pact, its own version of NATO, was dissolving. And the Soviet Union no longer has the ability to project power across the so-called third world or developing world. They don't have the money, they don't have the economic resources, and they don't have the social clout that they had in previous decades. And that's going to lead to some major changes for U.S. foreign policy, as America's primary enemy in the second half of the 20th century is fading away. And there are many contributing factors to the fall of the Soviet Union, which have come up in previous videos. A bloody and unpopular war in Afghanistan tore Soviet society apart, and it caused significant social unrest. In much the same way the Vietnam War provoked massive protests in the U.S. in the 60s and the 70s. If anything, the backlash against the Soviet-Afghan War was even worse, even more violent than anything that was experienced in the United States. It led to things like military coups, stuff that did not happen in the United States because of the durability of American democratic institutions. To make matters worse for the Soviet Union, oil prices began to fall after the end of the 1970s. In particular, they fell after 1985, which that brought prosperity to oil importing countries like the United States, but it spells economic ruin for the Soviet Union, which relied on oil exports to act as a source of revenue, to fund domestic projects, to fund foreign policy, to fund interventions across the developing world, and they just can't do it anymore. And you see signs of the decline of the Soviet Union in the Chernobyl disaster as well, which you can see on the right-hand side of this slide. The centralized Soviet economy struggled to adapt to these economic, social changes, and pressure from U.S. President Ronald Reagan, combined with Soviet Premier Mikhail Gorbachev's glasnost and perestroika, which was discussed previously, but essentially called for free speech, democracy, government transparency, and some capitalist reforms, it began to accelerate the collapse of the Soviet Union. And again, Gorbachev was a committed communist, but he believed that some of these reforms could actually prolong the Soviet Union, allowing some capitalist businesses like Pizza Hut and McDonald's into the Soviet Union might lead to economic prosperity. Granted, these American businesses, in many cases, were simply unaffordable for the average Russian person living in the Soviet Union, and really, in some ways, they kind of went against Russian culture when they opened a McDonald's in the Soviet Union in Moscow. They had to actually train the staff, the behind the cash register workers to smile, because in America, American service workers are trained to smile and be happy, and even if they don't really want to be working. But in the Soviet Union, that was not. Western customer service was an unfamiliar concept, and it kind of fits with the old Russian and Eastern European jokes that everybody's depressed in Russia, everyone's depressed in the in Eastern Europe. That in capitalist America, you wear a smile. In Soviet Union, smile wears you. Insert your favorite Eastern European joke here. Thanks to glasnost and perestroika, which called for increased democracy and transparency, and end to military interventions, not only in places like Afghanistan, but also in the satellite states, the Soviet military would no longer back the communist governments in the Eastern Bloc nations. And this will lead to mass uprisings by the people of these nations who are seeking self-government, independence, and self-determination. And a good example of this is the Polish solidarity movement, which was led by Lech Walesa, who you can see on the right-hand or left-hand side of this slide. You also have independence movements in Czechoslovakia as well. And I think Walesa looks a little bit like Nick Offerman. He looks a little bit like Ron Swanson. If they ever make a biopic or a period piece about Polish solidarity, they should get Offerman to play the leading role. And Americans were very focused on the independence movements across the Iron Curtain. Poland was a point of particular focus for many Americans because there were so many Americans of Polish ancestry, particularly in the Midwest. And Pope John Paul II, Catholic Pope, he was Polish, and he was a significant supporter of Polish independence as well. So American Catholics are going to want to support the Pope, and they're going to want to support independence and self-determination for the Polish people. And of course, the Soviet Union was often very suppressing of religion, especially of Catholicism. So the American people were aware of these movements and are going to want to support them. You also have independence movements further to the north in the Baltic states, in Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. The Baltic peoples actually made a 430-mile long chain in which they held hands. This chain was 430 miles long and had about 2 million people involved, and they were protesting independence and to break away from Soviet control. And this actually happened in 1989, the same year that the Berlin Wall fell, but it's part of the late 1980s, early 1990s collapse of the Soviet Union. Gorbachev and the Soviet government struggled to suppress massive civil unrest in the Caucasus and Central Asian regions as well, as the people in these areas fought for independence as well. And understandably so, they'd often been very badly treated by the white European Soviet government. Soviet Russia also began allowing democratic elections in 1990, leading to the election of Russia's first democratically elected president, Boris Yeltsin. And there was a failed military coup in which Yeltsin was involved that greatly weakened the extremely fragile and dissolving Soviet government in August of 1991. And this This failed coup, in large part, was led by military veterans of the Soviet-Afghan War, who were dissatisfied with the leadership of the Soviet government, which had sent them to a bloody and fruitless war in Central Asia. On December 25, 1991, Soviet Premier Mikhail Gorbachev resigned as Soviet Premier, and the Soviet Politburo voted itself and the Soviet Union out of existence. Technically, it was happening late on December 25th, and then in the wee hours of December 26th, the hammer and sickle flag of the Soviet Union fell, and the white, blue, and red flag of the Russian Federation rose. After nearly 88 years of rule, the Soviet Union had collapsed. In the immediate aftermath of the fall of the USSR, the Russian GDP decreased significantly. It's not going to rebound until pre-fall levels until about the mid-2000s, as Russia had been deprived of its satellite and its vassal states, and it struggled to establish a market economy. Russia maintained a large amount of its nuclear weapons holdings, although some of those holdings actually were also in countries like Kazakhstan and the Ukraine. Kazakhstan and the Ukraine both actually gave up the nuclear weapons they had inherited from the Soviet Union in exchange for economic and military support. A decision that will have significant implications, particularly for the Ukraine in the 2020s. And I should also add that although the Soviet Union had come to an end and Russia was no longer a communist country, it struggles to develop a true free market economy. There is a lot of corruption. There is a lot of oligarchic rule in Russia. Even to this day, and Russia's elections show signs of significant fraud. And many of the early leaders in the Russian Federation, even to this day, had been members of the Soviet government, most notably the current leader of Russia, Vladimir Putin. And Putin came to power in 1999 after being made acting president by Boris Yeltsin, who unexpectedly resigned. And he served several terms as Russian president. He's also served as the Russian prime minister as well. And as of 2024, a year ago, he began his fifth term as president and has maintained his power in Russia through what we would call spurious elections. And the Soviet Union ceased to exist, and the Russian Federation, though powerful, it's not the international superpower that the Soviet Union had been, and it doesn't have the kind of influence on the governments of Africa, the Americas, and East Asia the Soviets had. That doesn't mean that Russia cannot project power beyond its borders, both hard power in parts of Europe and Asia. Russia invaded Georgia in 2008. They seized control of the Crimean Peninsula in 2014, and then, of course, they invaded the Ukraine in 2022. And people have alleged that Russian soft power operations, what some people call misinformation and disinformation campaigns, these have affected the politics of Western nations. Although those are claims that are very debatable, and there's debate about to what extent did or could Russia have intervened or interfered in the politics of other nations. And if I were to talk about U.S.-Russian relations and Western and NATO relations with Russia in the post-Soviet era from 1991 to the present, I would say the big problem that really characterizes these relations is there was a lack of balance, and there was a lot of aggressive posturing against Russia, but then oftentimes not the military force and military deterrence to actually back up those promises. And you have to have balance, and you have to stick with what you say you're going to do. Teddy Roosevelt said we need to speak softly and carry a big stick. when it comes to foreign policy. I think, unfortunately, in many ways, the United States and its allies in NATO have done the opposite. We've talked very tough with Russia, and in some cases we've supported things like sanctions against Russia, but then enforcement of sanctions and making good on our promises of red lines and no-fly zones has been a lot more difficult. We wanted to make sure that we weren't going to appease Russia, because Russia was still not a truly democratic state even after the fall of the Soviet Union. It was still invading other countries even into the 2000s. But you have to actually follow up your promises with force. Otherwise, you just look weak. And if you're not going to keep your promises when it comes to foreign policy, you're better off not making those promises at all. And this is a problem with multiple presidential administrations of both major political parties. I'm not picking on any one president here, either former presidents or current presidents. And because it's a event that is still taking place, I'm not going to comment on the current situation in the Ukraine, except to say again that it's very sad to see such a massive loss of life, and I hope the conflict can be ended as quickly as possible and with as few additional lives lost as possible. Although communist states still existed, namely in North Korea, Cuba, and China, China having become closer with the United States starting in the 1970s and building more of a market economy, it still was not a truly democratic country. It was still a very authoritarian country, as seen in the 1989 Tiananmen Square protests and their really brutal suppression by the Chinese military. Nonetheless, it seemed to many people that at the end of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century that the values of America, capitalism and liberal democracy and multilateral foreign policy and internationalist politics and globalization of economies, that system had won out. What's often called the liberal order had won out. And that this was what a scholar named Francis Fukuyama called the end of history. The great totalitarian evils of the 20th century, fascism and communism, had now been defeated, even though there were still technically communist countries, and that the world could move on into a new era of peace and prosperity and international cooperation and collaboration. And this prediction to people in 2025 seems laughable and really overly optimistic, almost to the point of being naive. And really, there are even signs that Fukuyama's prediction was not a very good one. And these are things that Fukuyama actually would have recognized. For example, the first Gulf War of 1990 to 1991. I should also say that Fukuyama's interpretation of the 20th century is very similar to what is called the Whig, W-H-I-G view of history, that progress is assured and certain, that the world will get to be a better place in the future, that the sum total of human knowledge will always be improved and added, and that we will get more prosperous and more civilized as a species as we move forward through time. It's a very optimistic view of history and of human progress. Of course, Fukuyama's vision did not really come true. There were signs that his vision was not a very accurate one, even before he came up with his pronouncements in '92, of course. But there was some question about what would America do now that the Soviet Union was either collapsing or on the verge of falling. There's an adage that says the more things change, the more they stay the same. And in many ways, U.S. foreign policy at the end of the 20th century, it almost harkens back to the foreign policy of the late 19th century, making the world safe for democracy, a form of imperialism, often for American economic factors and to mollify our allies. These are things that are going to emerge in the 1990s and the 2000s and beyond. And you see a good example of this with dealings with smaller adversaries, most notably in the 1990s, the first Gulf War of 1990 to 1991. And as part of the first Gulf War, there are two operations, Operation Desert Shield and Operation Desert Storm. Starting in 1990, the United States and a coalition of other nations began sending troops to Saudi Arabia to protect Saudi Arabia against a potential invasion or an attack from Iraq, Saudi Arabia's neighbor to the east. And in 1991, the U.S. will lead a coalition of about 30 other nations, which will include the United Kingdom, France, and Saudi Arabia, to liberate the nation of Kuwait and then to invade Iraq. Iraqi leader Saddam Hussein, who had become a dictator, he had ordered the invasion of Kuwait, a small but wealthy oil-rich nation to the south and east of Iraq, as you can see here. Saddam Hussein alleged that Kuwaiti oil drilling companies, which in many cases were owned by British companies, they had secretly drilled into Iraqi territory and were stealing Iraqi oil. And Saddam Hussein also needed oil and additional revenue after the very disastrous Iran-Iraq War. The Iran-Iraq War was, of course, fought from 1980 to 1988, and that conflict in part inspired the Iran-Contra affair, in which the U.S. sold weapons to Iran because they were fighting Iraq and they needed more supplies. It was also done for other reasons as well, to get American hostages back and to raise revenue to support the Contra militia in Nicaragua. But Saddam Hussein was a megalomaniacal, very totalitarian leader. He committed massive human rights abuses against people in his own country, and he also was threatening other nations in the Middle East and violating international norms. He was threatening Saudi Arabia, he was threatening Israel, and he was talking about merging or possibly even taking over Syria as well. To many people living in the 1990s, he may have almost looked like an Arab or Middle Eastern Hitler that was on the rise. And there was fear that if we did not act against Saddam Hussein, that we would basically be engaging in appeasement, and we might be dealing with a much more dangerous opponent in the future. And although the Iran-Iraq War had been very destructive for Iraq, Saddam was rebuilding his military, which is why he needed the oil resources of Kuwait. In fact, on the eve of the Iran or of the Persian Gulf War, the first Gulf War, he actually had the fourth largest military in the world. President George H.W. Bush and British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher were concerned that if Iraq was not confronted over its invasion of Kuwait, it might seize control of other oil-producing regions and perhaps even gain a near monopoly on Middle Eastern oil. In addition, it could threaten our emerging alliances with Saudi Arabia and our older alliance with Israel as well, as those were nations that Saddam Hussein often threatened and promised attacks against. So there's economic reasons, there's considerations for oil resources, and there's diplomatic reasons why the United States built a coalition to counter Saddam Hussein in Iraq. After months of deployment in Saudi Arabia, which was itself an accomplishment because Saudi Arabia, while it was becoming an ally of the United States, it had a traditionalist, Sunni Muslim, and Arab tribal culture. And when I say tribal, I don't mean that in a primitive way. I mean that tribal in the sense that family groups are very important in Saudi Arabian culture. And the American system of doing things, particularly the American military system, was very different than the culture of Saudi Arabia. But after the deployment in Saudi Arabia, the U.S.-led coalition will invade Kuwait in January of 1990, and by early February, Kuwait will be liberated, and the coalition forces will push into Iraq and will almost entirely defeat the Iraqi conventional army by the really by the middle of February of 1991. This is a war that's over in a matter of weeks. The U.S. will suffer 146 casualties during the war, and many Desert Storm veterans report very serious illnesses such as Gulf War syndrome. This was because as Saddam's troops were fleeing Kuwait and back into Iraq, they lit oil wells on fire, and the really toxic black burning oil smoke, when inhaled, it's a serious carcinogen, and it can cause headaches and nerve diseases and stuff like that. I've interviewed veterans of the first Gulf War who deal with Gulf War syndrome. It's a very serious illness. But the United States was able to defeat Iraq. Iraq's military used a lot of older Soviet weapons that they had purchased from the Soviets, and Saddam Hussein would ally himself with the Soviets or with the West, whoever was going to give him the best deal. But his technology was comparatively ossified compared to the tech used by the United States, compared to the stealth bombers of the U.S., the multi-launch rocket systems, or MLRSs, used by the United States, which were very effective against the largely tank-based military that Saddam was using. And I've interviewed veterans of the first Gulf War who cited the technological advantage that they had as being a major part of the relatively easy U.S. coalition victory. And it wasn't just stealth bombers and multi-launch rocket systems. It was also things like Patriot missiles, which were used to shoot down what were called Scud missiles that were used by Saddam's forces. Scud missiles were older Soviet missiles, actually. And the U.S. military also experimented with early unmanned drones as well, which by the end of the fighting in February, things had gotten so bad that Iraqi troops were basically surrendering to unmanned drones. And some veterans I've talked to said that towards the end of the conflict, they had scored such a resounding victory against the Iraqis, they almost began to feel bad for their Iraqi opponents. But things happened so quickly in the first Gulf War, really dizzying success for the U.S.-led coalition, and the rapid nature of this war and of the rapidly moving battlefront is really what leads to the growth of CNN as a news network and the 24-hour news cycle that we have today, for better or for worse. And the first Gulf War, combined with Operation Urgent Fury in Grenada back in the 1980s, and Operation Just Cause in Panama from 1989 to 1990, it showed that the U.S. could fight conventional wars against conventional opponents very effectively with minimal casualties, thanks in part to our superior technology. The U.S., however, will continue to struggle with counterinsurgency and irregular warfare in later conflicts in this period, similar to how we struggled during the Vietnam conflict. And you really see this with things like the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan from 2001 to 2021, and then the second war in Iraq. Will show that a powerful and sophisticated military, really the most powerful and sophisticated military in world history, is going to struggle against a lightly armed but determined insurgency. And here are some more images of the first Gulf War. As I mentioned before, oil wells were burned by Saddam's retreating forces, creating a really toxic smoke that would lead to Gulf War syndrome amongst veterans of the conflict. And there were only 146 American casualties during the war. But that doesn't mean that these losses in human lives are any less heartbreaking for the families and friends of the servicemen who passed away. Now we've come to the 1992 presidential election. On the domestic front, incumbent President George H.W. Bush, he ran for re-election in 1992. And as I mentioned before, Bush Sr., while he did continue some of Reagan's policies, particularly the more aggressive foreign policy stances, he was overall less conservative than Reagan was. He was more acceptable of tax increases. He was less opposed to social program expansion. In fact, Bush Sr., along with his political opponents even, he talked about something called the peace dividend, that in a post-Cold War world, America could, for every dollar that was not spent on foreign policy and the military, that was another dollar that could be spent on domestic social programs and other social developments that you would say are more liberal-leaning, are things like the ADA Act of 1990, which Bush supported. So he was a Republican and a more conservative candidate by the standards of the period, but he was less conservative than his predecessor, Ronald Reagan, was. And really, Bush was much more of a neoconservative as well. And I mean that he was willing to compromise on many domestic issues in order to get his more aggressive foreign policy goals realized. And you'll see a continuation of neoconservatism really to some degree, every president after Bush will have some neoconservative political beliefs, but neoconservatism really begins to be challenged at the end of the 2000s and through the 2010s. To a point where neoconservatisms nowadays are being called a neoconservative or a neocon. It's basically an insult. It's a pejorative. But Bush had alienated himself from many of the more conservative voters who were becoming the backbone of the Republican Party. He had promised to not raise taxes. He'd said very famously, "Read my lips, no new taxes." But there had been new taxes. The country was also gripped with an economic recession as well. Overall, across time, the most important issue to American voters is economic issues. And on this backdrop, the Democratic governor of Arkansas, William Jefferson Clinton, or Bill Clinton, ran for election. And Clinton promised to remedy the recession the country was facing, and he promised to make the economy the primary focus of his administration if he were elected president. His campaign slogan, or one of them, was, "It's the economy, stupid," referencing the problems that the country was facing and basically attacking Bush's focus on foreign policy. And Clinton's campaign manager was James Carville, who's still a political commentator to this day, but he was a very aggressive and very successful campaign manager, kind of what Lee Atwater was for Bush Sr. back in the 1988 election. The Bush campaign, they attacked Clinton for his youth, his inexperience, his lack of military service. Bush had been a very successful pilot in World War II, whereas Clinton had avoided military service in the Vietnam War. He'd tried to join the reserves in order to avoid going to Vietnam, but ended up not even really having to do that because the Vietnam War ended. And he actively protested the Vietnam War, and they also criticized Clinton for allegedly smoking marijuana, to which Clinton claimed that he did not really inhale it, whatever that means. And there were also whispers about Clinton's alleged sexual improprieties that dated all the way back to his time as governor. And a little bit more about Clinton. Politically speaking, he came from more the center of the Democratic Party. He was from the South. He was a white man from the South. He had a Southern accent. And although he supported many liberal policies, he did it in a very conservative, coded way. He talked about how the federal government had gotten to be too big and gotten to be too corrupt, that it was spending too much money. And this kind of rhetoric really played to a lot of white working class and blue collar people who you might have called Reagan Democrats in the 1980s, who were moving in a more Republican conservative direction, but they could come back over to the Democratic Party to vote for Clinton. And Clinton's promises to fix the economy the way that Reagan had done certainly would have resonated with these blue collar voters. And Clinton also did a very good job courting African Americans too, leading to the joke, which is really laughable today. But at the time, they joked that Clinton was America's first black president because of his very successful outreach to African American voters. And racial tension was on high in 1992 after the Rodney King incident, in which the Los Angeles Police Department had assaulted a African American man named Rodney King, who was allegedly fleeing the police on a parole violation while under the influence. And you see um, racial tension will remain high in the 1990s when you look at things like the O.J. Simpson murder trial of 1994 to 1995, in which O.J. Simpson, a black NFL player, allegedly, we'll say, killed his white wife. The majority of African Americans believed he was innocent, and the majority of white Americans believed that he was guilty. In the end, he was acquitted. Many say because of the racial composition of the jury, but he ended up losing in civil court, being labeled responsible for the death of his wife. So Clinton probably did a better job on racial issues in the 1992 election than Bush did. I also think that the media was far more charitable to Clinton than they had been to Bush Sr. They asked Clinton softball questions like boxers or briefs, things of that nature, whereas Bush was getting asked tough questions about his presidential record because he was, the incumbent president. In the end, Clinton's successful campaign built a coalition that propelled him to the White House, as he won commandingly in parts of the South and the Midwest that definitely would have rejected a more liberal candidate. Bush and the Republicans also lost because of the conservative vote was split between Bush and Ross Perot, who you see on the right-hand side of the slide. He was a libertarian billionaire businessman from Texas. And Perot was one of the few third-party candidates in American history that I think had a decent chance of becoming president. He really reached conservative voters who were very fiscally minded, very economically minded. Bush's promise of no new taxes and then allowing new taxes to come through led to a lot of anger. Some of those people may have chosen to vote for Clinton, but others would have chosen to vote for Perot. And many people point to some of Perot's campaign speaking gaffes as being what ultimately undid him. Remember, he was not a career politician the way Bush and Clinton were. There was one speech in which Perot was addressing an audience that had a significant amount of African American voters, and Perot kind of leaned in and said, "You people," to them. And he wasn't trying to sound aggressive, but the media really painted Perot as being racist for using such informal language when talking to an African-American audience. And after that, his poll numbers fell, and basically he became a spoiler candidate in the 1992 election that also helped Clinton win the presidency. Clinton, despite his youth and relative inexperience in national politics, was very charismatic. He was a natural showman, far more so than Bush was, who was seen as being kind of a out of touch, beltway politician. Undecided voters in the 1992 election reported that they didn't know who they were going to vote for in the 1992 election, but that they shook hands with candidate Clinton, and then they knew they had to vote for him. One woman said she didn't know who she was going to vote for, and she saw Bill Clinton play the saxophone, and then she knew she had to vote for Clinton. Other voters, particularly young women, said that there was a certain magnetism and an energy and a charisma about Clinton that really drew them to him and led them to vote for him. It was said that he did very well with suburban women. And so consequently, many undecided voters, they pulled the lever on the election day for Slick Willie, as he was called. And Clinton's relationship with women is going to come up later in this video. So we'll talk about Clinton's domestic legislation first, particularly legislation in his first term. And overall, domestic policy was more Clinton's focus than foreign policy, which makes sense in post-Cold War America. The United States, its leadership is still trying to figure out what the new foreign policy struggle will be. Will it be making the world safe for democracy against dictators like Saddam Hussein? Will it be bringing Russia into the Western fold, or will it be countering authoritarianism in countries like China? China being an important adversary of the United States during this period, but also an important trading partner. Our relationship with China in more recent years has become much more openly adversarial than it was in this period in the 1990s. And international terrorism becomes a much more serious issue in the 1990s and 2000s as well. But we'll start by talking about domestic policy. And Clinton was able to have a pretty robust agenda in his first term domestically, because in the election, 92, not only did he win the election, but the Democrats swept the House of Representatives and the Senate as well. And during his first term, which began in 1993, Clinton supported a variety of both liberal and conservative policies, although when taken as a group, Clinton's policies, within the context of the period, they still leaned to the left. Clinton signed laws that were designed to increase taxes, especially on the upper class, something that liberals might support. And the idea was these taxes would be increased to make the country more fiscally sound. And ultimately, they're actually going to balance the budget one year, the Clinton administration. Granted, he's also going to do that with significant assistance and, you might say, prodding from Republicans, particularly Republicans in the House of Representatives, led by Congressman Newt Gingrich. So again, there's conservatism and there's liberalism as well. Clinton also signed into law the North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA, which called for free trade between the U.S., Canada, and Mexico, although many protectionist Democrats and Republicans as well did not support this legislation. NAFTA was part of that larger trend of neoliberal economics in the United States that begins after World War II and really accelerates in the 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s. Neoliberalism has often been opposed by Democrats and Republicans, but it was also supported by both Republicans and by Democrats. And NAFTA and its legacy are going to remain controversial to this day, and NAFTA will ultimately be replaced by the U.S., Mexico, Canada trade agreement. And that USMCA trade agreement was made in 2018 during the first Trump presidency. And neoliberalism, like neoconservatism, has become almost an insult, almost a pejorative term. You don't want to be labeled a neoliberal, regardless of what political party you come from, regardless of your overall general political ideology. Neoconservatism has fallen out of favor, just as neoliberalism has fallen out of favor. Clinton also supported welfare reform, a nod to Reagan-era conservatives, most notably in the establishment of the TANF program, TANF, or Temporary Assistance to Needy Families. And this was more of a development that's in the second term, but it's still worth discussing here. Again, Clinton supported some conservative policies, but he also came to support many conservative policies as well, because as time went on, Republicans and conservatives got more of a foothold in Congress, so he had to work with a more conservative Congress to get things done. To appeal to liberals, Clinton will support Don't Ask, Don't Tell, which allowed closeted LGBT people to serve in the military. Within the context of the 1990s, that was liberal legislation, because before Don't Ask, Don't Tell, gay people could be banned from military service. Don't Ask, Don't Tell was repealed in 2010, which allowed gay people to openly serve in the U.S. military, not have to keep their sexual orientation hidden. And this is a more conservative piece of legislation, both within the context of the 1990s and the present. Clinton signed into law the Defense of Marriage Act, DOMA, in 1996, which declared that marriage in the U.S. must be between one man and one woman. And that's going to appeal particularly to the evangelical Christian religious right, which are really a very powerful and important voter bloc in the late 20th century and the early 21st century. And DOMA was overturned gradually, starting with some Supreme Court cases in 2013, and then with additional legislation in 2022. But gay marriage essentially became legal across the United States in about 2015. I would say the most controversial piece of legislation that comes out of Clinton's domestic policy was the 1994 Omnibus Crime Bill. And this was legislation that he supported. It was signed in 1994, and it was written in large part by then Senator Joe Biden, Democratic politician from Delaware, future vice president and U.S. president. And the 1994 crime bill, it intensified the war on drugs through instituting death sentences for big drug dealers. If you traffic enough drugs, you can face capital punishment. It also set up mandatory minimum sentencing for not just dealing drugs and manufacturing them, but also for simple possession of drugs. So it's about punishing not only dealers, but users as well. The crime bill also included provisions for gun control, barring the manufacture and sale of new semi-automatic rifles, pistols, and shotguns that had detachable magazines that could hold more than 10 rounds. It was called the assault weapons ban, and the term assault weapon is a bit nebulous. It's not really a technical firearms term. You have assault rifles, which are rifles, weapons that have a rifle caliber, like a AK-47 round, 7.62 by 39 millimeter round, for example. And then there's submachine guns, which shoot pistol rounds, like 9 millimeter, that are automatic. You have assault rifles, you have submachine guns. Assault weapons basically meant any weapon that could hold more than 10 rounds. So it's a little bit more nebulous. It could include rifles, it could include pistols, and it could include shotguns. And this legislation, we would definitely call it tough on crime. Tough on crime was what the majority of politicians would have supported in this period, regardless of whether they were Republican or Democrat. This legislation was bipartisan as well at the time. The bill has since come under fire from both the political left and the political right. People on the political left will criticize the Omnibus Crime Bill because it intensified the war on drugs and it increased use of the death penalty. People on the right will criticize it as well because of its gun control provisions, which, by the way, the assault weapons ban actually expired in 2004 and it was not renewed. Campaigning against gun control laws actually became a much more important conservative issue, really from the 1990s on to the present. Another criticism that you often hear about the 1994 crime bill, particularly from African Americans and from anti-prison activists, is that the percentage of incarcerated Americans increased substantially after 1994. The war on drugs increases across the 20th century. That was a theme that came up frequently in this course. It accelerated in the 1970s, in 1980s, in the Nixon and Reagan administrations, but you can see that the war on drugs really intensifies with the 1994 crime bill, with its mandatory minimum sentencing. And this, 1994, is right about here. This is when the imprisoned population really substantially increases in the United States, to a point where well over 2% of the American population is in some kind of lockup or prison, which is a very high number for a free, liberal democratic country like the United States. And the majority or the largest group rather, of imprisoned people in the United States are African American. And when you look at the data overall, you find that um, African American people who are convicted are much more likely to receive harsher and longer prison sentences than other groups when they're convicted. But I always try to be as objective and as fair as possible in my discussion of historical events. I will say, though, that crime rates in America have been increasing since about the 1960s, all the way into the 1990s. In the 1990s, crime rates began to fall considerably, and they really fell pretty consistently until about the 2020s, where they increased again. Thankfully, as of 2025, they appear to be going back down again, but I think it's very possible that the 1994 crime bill contributed to the declining crime rates in the United States that happened in the 90s and 2000s and 2010s. Others might point to the fact that the American population was getting older, and older people are just less likely to engage in crime. Some might also even point to things like the internet. People, instead of going out and committing crimes, they can let out their frustrations online and do it digitally rather than out on the streets. So Clinton faced some challenges in his first term, um, and he supported some controversial legislation. Clinton does win the 1996 presidential election. He was the incumbent, and he ran against Bob Dole, a Republican politician from Kansas who had a very conservative reputation. Dole ran a very negative campaign against Clinton. Dole touted his own accomplishments as a member of the older World War II generation, his work in the Senate, and he attacked Clinton for being a spoiled baby boomer. The boomers were seen as a younger, more dynamic group in the 1990s than they are today. And initially, Clinton struggled as the Republicans had regained control of Congress in 1994 during the midterms. And the economy in the 1990s was still slowly rebuilding itself. Overall, the 1990s economy was not as dynamic as the 1980s economy. As time went on, though, Clinton had strength as an incumbent, and Bob Dole just did not run a very good campaign. He looked uncomfortable when he made public remarks. He would sometimes refer to himself in the third person. He would say things like, Bob Dole doesn't like that Clinton fella, stuff like that. And it was just very unusual and off-putting, particularly to younger voters. And it was also said that Dole was very off-putting to particularly suburban women, who are an important voter demographic. And in the end, Clinton wins his re-election. Ross Perot also ran for re-election, or rather ran as a third-party candidate again in 1996, and didn't do as well in 1996 as he had in 1992. But again, Perot would have taken more votes from Dole and the conservatives and Republicans than he would have from Clinton. Clinton continued many of the same center-left policies during the second term of his presidency that he had also supported in his first. On the whole, foreign policy was less of a focus for the Clinton administration, but the U.S. did have foreign policy operations and military interventions in Clinton's presidency, both in his first term and in his second term. In 1993, early in Clinton's first term, the U.S. engaged in a partially UN-organized intervention in Somalia, and the Clinton presidency wanted to avoid sending too many U.S. troops to conflict zones across the world to minimize U.S. casualties, and that way domestic issues could be more the focus of American politics. But the 1993 U.S. Intervention in Somalia saw the Black Hawk Down incident, in which a U.S. Black Hawk helicopter was shot down in Mogadishu, Somalia, during a insertion and extraction raid. 18 American soldiers were killed, and perhaps 1,000 Somalis were killed in the shooting down of this helicopter, and then the rescue of the downed American military personnel. And it was in many ways a black mark on the Clinton administration's foreign policy. It was a bad look to see the bodies of American soldiers carried through the streets of dragged through the streets of Mogadishu by Somalian forces. However, Clinton found his footing in foreign policy as time went on, and in 1995, largely at the behest of Great Britain, the U.S. will intervene as a part of NATO in the Balkans in 1995 in Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia was a multi-ethnic, multi-religious area where there had been centuries of conflict as a result of the imperial policies of the Ottoman Turks and the Austro-Hungarians. And the Serbian population of Yugoslavia, they wanted to suppress other ethnic groups, including Croatians or Croats who had a different culture than they did, a different religion. The Serbs were a Slavic culture and they practiced Orthodox Christianity, whereas the Croatians practice Catholicism, and their culture is much more Western European. They also wanted to suppress Albanian and Bosnian people who were usually Muslim. And the actions of Serbian Yugoslavian forces essentially were ethnic cleansing. And so the United States will intervene in 1995, and they'll do so again in Kosovo, in the Balkans, in the former Yugoslavia, in 1999. And overall, the U.S. Operations with NATO in the Balkans during the Clinton presidency were considered much more successful than what happened in Somalia. But critics of the Clinton administration would argue that his presidency was very focused on domestic issues. It was focused on what we would call humanitarian interventions, and that they should have been more watchful and better prepared for the rise of radical Islamic terrorism, and that mistakes that were made by the Clinton administration, particularly poor communication between various U.S. intelligence agencies, is what allowed Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda to plan and then orchestrate the 9/11 attacks, because there were many radical Islamic terrorist attacks and Al-Qaeda-led operations in the 1990s. There's many signs that a larger attack was coming, but again, the Clinton administration, and then actually the Bush administration as well, they were much more focused on other issues, and that enabled the great or the horrific terrorist attacks that took place on September 11th, 2001. Clinton's political accomplishments, and indeed his entire presidency, have in many ways been overshadowed by his impeachment. Clinton was impeached by the Republican-controlled House of Representatives in December of 1998 for the charges of perjury and the obstruction of justice. Clinton allegedly had a sexual relationship with a young female staffer named Monica Lewinsky, and then he had tried to cover up the relationship, along with lying about an affair that he'd had with another woman named Paula Jones. And there were other women who came out of the woodwork and claimed that they had been in compromising situations with President Clinton, or when he was governor before that. And there are power imbalances between a powerful male elected official and young female staffers. And there were also allegations that Bill Clinton's wife, Hillary Rodham Clinton, had essentially assisted in these cover-ups to protect her husband's political career, and really by protecting her husband's political career, protecting her own political career as well. Hillary Clinton had well-known political ambitions as First Lady, and these will be confirmed later on when she becomes a senator, a Secretary of State, and eventually a 2016 presidential candidate. She was also a candidate in the 2008 election as well. Clinton was questioned about his relationship with these women, and he very famously said, "I did not have sexual relations with that woman, Ms. Lewinsky." And later on, when he was pressured about it and forced to answer more questions, he changed his statement, asking interviewers to define the meaning of the word is. And he'd revise his statement by saying, well, that's not really what I said. I said I did not have sexual relations with that woman, Ms. Lewinsky, like he was talking to Monica Lewinsky. They didn't call him Slick Willie for no reason. And Clinton's supporters said that the president's life should be off limits. The only reason that he was changing his statements was because the press and Clinton's political opponents were prying into things that they shouldn't be prying into. Previous presidents had sexual affairs that were well known, JFK, FDR, and people at the time didn't pry into those things. But America had changed quite a bit by the 1990s. We have a 24-hour news cycle. There's a need for constant news reporting on everything. Social trust was way lower in the 1990s than it was in previous decades. The Americans, by default, had much more mistrust for their government and their elected officials than they had in previous decades. They wouldn't have looked into what the president was up to in the early 60s the way they would in the 1990s. Opponents of Clinton said that the president has to be the leader of the free world, and he has to be a paragon of virtue and moral propriety, and that it's inappropriate for a president to be engaging in these marital infidelities. It makes America look bad to the rest of the world, particularly to more religious Islamic countries in the Middle East, where the United States is trying to make political alliances and have more influence, and therefore this behavior is unacceptable for a president to be engaging in. But again, the charges that Clinton was actually brought up on were perjury and obstruction of justice. He wasn't actually on trial for his extramarital relationships. Although some who engage in more like feminist theory and things like that would argue that because of the power imbalances, these relationships were innately wrong and in some ways almost non-consensual. In the end, though, the impeachment went through the House, it went on to the Senate, and the Senate voted to acquit Clinton largely along party lines. That's because you need a two-thirds majority to actually convict a president in the Senate. And while Clinton was acquitted, he actually did lose his law license because of the perjury charge. And in the end, though, Clinton finished his presidency with pretty low approval ratings, but his reputation did rebound somewhat after his presidency was over. Overall, Clinton has been viewed as a successful president by American academics and presidential historians. He supported a variety of conservative and liberal policies, and overall was a more liberal politician than Ronald Reagan or George H.W. Bush. But the fact that he coded conservative in his language and in how he conducted himself publicly, it was still a sign of the power of the conservative movement in American politics, of the emerging Republican majority that was still described in the 1960s. Those were still very influential movements in American politics well into the late 1990s, into the 2000s. And because of his dynamic personality, because of his variety of political issues that he supported, he did appeal to a variety of voters. And Clinton was a politician of the sixth party system. He was dealing with a Republican Party as his opponent that is strong in the Southeast and the West, but he is able to get some people in those parts of the country to vote for him. Meanwhile, he does better in parts of the Northeast and West Coast and parts of the Midwest. The Midwest is kind of a conflict zone between the Republican Party and the Democratic Party. He had a very amiable personality, which made many people like him, but perhaps his very amiable personality, particularly the relationship he had with young women, also got him into trouble as well. And he's generally seen as one of the more popular presidents of the 21st or of the 20th century, alongside JFK and Ronald Reagan. He left office with rather low approval ratings, as presidents usually do. His approval ratings would increase with time, Although over the last few years his popularity has decreased as things like the Me Too movement have risen up and gender relations have changed in the recent years, and also his relationship with wealthy billionaire people who have been accused of other sexual crimes like Jeffrey Epstein has also tarnished Clinton's legacy. But those are developments that happened in more recent years. Now we'll come to the 2000 presidential election. And I'm just going to go over the main points of this election. We'll dig into it a bit more actually when I get to the Bush v. Gore Supreme Court case later in this video. Um, to start things off, in 2000, Clinton's vice president, Al Gore, a Democrat from Tennessee, and a rather conservative Democrat by the standards of the day, he ran against Republican George W. Bush, the son of former President George H.W. Bush. Bush had been the successful and very popular governor of Texas. He was considered to be young. He was considered to be relatively handsome. And the belief was he would appeal to centrist voters and suburban women much more than an older, crustier, more conservative Republican like Bob Dole would have. So he's meant to be almost like the Democrats' version of Bill Clinton, you might say. And that might seem like an odd comparison, knowing how the Bush presidency would turn out, but that was what campaign strategists were thinking in 2000 and during the primaries. And Bush also made significant attempts to court Latino voters who generally at this point are voting Democrat in American politics. Bush was he was fluent in Spanish. His mother-in-law was Latino. And the belief was that Bush, with his knowledge of the Spanish language and with his more moderate policies, and also with his very outspoken Christian religious beliefs, that he could appeal to Latino voters in the way that perhaps an older, more conservative Republican could not. And Bush was also, it was believed that he could appeal to white, middle American, blue-collar people. He had a very folksy way of speaking. He had a rather strong Southern accent. And although he had risen to political prominence in Texas, the Bush family was a very powerful Northeastern, very politically connected family. Bush went to Yale University. He was part of the Skull and Crossbones student organization. He was often characterized as the cowboy president who made speaking gaffes and was uneducated. A lot of that was a facade. In some ways, I think actually the things that Bush was mocked for were actually intentional decisions by Bush himself and by his campaign to make him seem more down to earth. But he had also struggled with alcoholism and actually had a DUI in the past, which came back to haunt him in the 2000 election. But the polls were very tight. Both candidates focused on domestic issues because the American economy was growing in the 1990s, but it was very unstable. There was a lot of booms and busts and recessions. And going into 2000, there was concern about what was called the Y2K crisis, that computer technology, which America and the world were increasingly becoming reliable on, that computers might all simultaneously crash on January 1st of 2000. So kitchen table domestic issues were the priority for both Bush and Gore in this election. And it's a very tight election, very close. It essentially came down to one state. I'll talk about that later. And Bush very narrowly won the election after a lot of controversy and after Supreme Court cases. And he won the election without the popular vote. He won with the Electoral College. And to make things more complicated, there was a Green Party candidate, a third-party candidate named Ralph Nader, who very likely almost certainly would have taken votes primarily from Gore, much more so than from Bush. So Bush won the 2000 election with a bit of an asterisk attached. And I'll go into the Bush v. Gore case later in this video. Here are some things to keep in mind about the 1990s economy. The 90s economy overall was good, but there were recessions at the beginning of the economy. And then there was significant volatility throughout the rest of the decade. You had the dot-com bubble that lasted from about the mid 1990s, 1995 or so, into the 2000s. These are issues that voters would have been very aware of. Basically, the dot-com bubble was a lot of new companies are being formed using new computing and internet technology, and they were often drastically overvalued, as you can see. And some of these companies, like Amazon, are actually still around today. Other companies like Yahoo, which used to be a very hot stock in the past, are a shadow of what they once were in terms of the economy. You also had economic fraud, which often doesn't get discovered until years after the fraud took place, and that's where Enron comes in. The Enron scandal was essentially shareholders being defrauded by the Enron company. Enron, of course, was a energy and commodities company, but the idea is this is a period of economic dynamism, economic volatility and instability, and even things like fraud. In some ways, the 1990s economy reminds me a lot of the 1920s economy. And then, of course, there's the famous Y2K scandal, in which it's not really a scandal as much as it was fear that computers and the internet would crash December 31st, 1999 at 11:59 p.m. They wouldn't recognize that it was a new year and a new millennium, and that they would all crash, and we would be back in the Stone Age, which to us in 2025 seems like a rather laughable thing. And I lived through this stuff myself, and I thought it was kind of a silly thing. But my family actually did buy some Y2K supplies in case there were power outages or in case supermarkets got overrun with people panic buying everything. Our Y2K supplies ended up just being used as hurricane supplies, so it wasn't that big of a deal for us. But generally speaking, those that were knowledgeable of computers said that the necessary patches and software were installed to prevent a crash really by about the summer of 2000 or the summer of 1999, and that it wasn't really the issue. The issue was resolved months before the beginning of the year 2000. Bush was inaugurated in 2001. He advocated for many domestic economic policies to mitigate the aforementioned dot-com bubble, and he also encouraged things like tax cuts to stimulate the economy, but he also increased government spending and stimulus as well. Bush was more economically liberal in many ways than earlier Republican conservatives. He really believed in more of a Keynesian style of economics, that demand side economics rather than supply side economics should be the focus of the American political system. And that's more of a liberal stance on things. Bush was more conservative on issues like abortion, likely because of his religious beliefs, but people often don't know much about Bush's domestic policy, and this is largely because his domestic policy was overshadowed by his foreign policy. And Bush's foreign policy was defined by the September 11th, 2001 attacks. On September 11th, 2001, hijackers from the radical Islamic terrorist organization Al-Qaeda took control of 4 passenger airliners and crashed them into several targets across the U.S. And these terrorist attacks had been in planning for many years. There was a lack of communication between the FBI, the CIA, and the NSA. They were aware of Osama bin Laden and his plans. They were aware of operations by Al-Qaeda, and that there were Al-Qaeda agents that were trying to get into the United States, but there was a lack of communication that took place during the Clinton administration and during the Bush administration. People often like to say that this was a false flag operation, or that the U.S. government knew about these attacks and let them happen as a pretext for the war on terror, but the evidence that I've seen is more just incompetence and negligence is what enabled the September 11th attacks, similar to the Pearl Harbor attacks. People often say that the Pearl Harbor attacks were allowed to happen to lead the United States into the First World War, Second World War. They say similar things about 9/11 as well. But there is no question, though, that nearly 3,000 Americans died in these attacks. About 25,000 were injured as well. About $2 billion of damage were done as aircraft struck the World Trade Center, the North Tower first, the South Tower second, and then the Pentagon, the headquarters of the Department of Defense, was struck as well. And a fourth aircraft was hijacked and was likely bound for the U.S. Capitol building, or possibly the White House, most likely the Capitol building. And that building, that aircraft, crashed in the fields of Pennsylvania after the passengers of the aircraft tried to retake control of the plane. As I mentioned, in the aftermath of the September 11th attack, the Bush administration condemned the attacks and called for a aggressive response against Al-Qaeda and against Osama bin Laden, the leader of Al-Qaeda, who was in hiding in Afghanistan in 2001. Bush famously said, "These attacks shattered steel, but they cannot dent the steel of American resolve." Bush called for intervention to stop Osama bin Laden and to bring freedom and democracy to Afghanistan and to combat terrorist groups around the world. It's often been called the Bush doctrine of foreign policy, that America should be involved in aggressive foreign policy, not for business reasons, not to stop communism, but to stop terrorism and to bring the values of liberty and democracy around the world. And in some ways, the Bush doctrine harkens back to the foreign policy at the beginning of the 1900s. For example, I think it really has a lot of similarity with Woodrow Wilson's moral foreign policy. But as with Wilson's foreign policy, there's expectation of freedom and democracy, then there's the reality of the warfare and violence that often comes with these interventions. The same can be said of the foreign policy advocated for by the Bush administration and then by presidencies that came after Bush. But you have to remember what the American people were feeling after the September 11th attacks. I remember it. It was a frightening and in some ways a very traumatic experience. I was late for school that day. The attacks took place at about 9 o'clock in the morning, and my mom was bringing me to school, and we were walking into the school, and there was a delivery man outside. He yelled at my mom, "Hey, lady, did you hear? There was an attack at the World Trade Center. They blew up the building." And I looked over at my mom, who was walking me into school, and I said, "Mom, is that true?" And she said, No, it's not true. That man's lying. He's crazy." And then she put me into school, which there had been attacks at the World Trade Center back in the 1990s. So this was maybe not as surprising as you might think. But I think my mom knew that the attack was real, and she just didn't want me to be scared as I was going into school that day. But my wife actually is from New York, and her family were in the fire department actually in Long Island, and fire departments sent firefighters from their own local departments, all the way into New York City to assist in the rescue operations for the people that were trapped in the buildings as they collapsed. Really, really frightening, really harrowing stuff. In some ways, it was kind of like the Pearl Harbor attacks, in which over 2,000 Americans died in a single day. And the Kennedy assassination, in which a beloved U.S. president was killed. There was a feeling of anger and shock and sorrow, but also betrayal as well. Betrayal that we had been, civilians had been killed by terrorists. And in some ways, how could our government let this happen? And what was our government going to do to stop these terrorists and to try to help us have a sense of justice? This is Osama bin Laden, who was the leader of Al-Qaeda, a terrorist organization that its name translates to the base, actually. And bin Laden was from a wealthy Saudi Arabian family. He was well educated, well connected, well traveled, in some ways very cosmopolitan. But over time, he'd really come to embrace Islamic fundamentalism and radical politicized Islam. and he believed that the United States and Israel, the Great Satan and the Little Satan, as many radical Islamists call them, had intervened too much in the Islamic world, that they did not support traditional Islamic values, and that they were his moral and political enemies. Bin Laden also opposed the Soviet Union, a secular communist government that intervened in Afghanistan and invaded Afghanistan. He also opposed the governments of many Islamic nations, which these leaders were, in some cases, very authoritarian, but they were secular and in some ways westernized and allied with the West. So there were many people that bin Laden hated and regarded as his enemies. But he was one of the architects of the September 11th attacks, and he became public enemy number one for the United States. And the goal was to eliminate bin Laden, specifically by capturing him alive. That was the initial plan. But over time, the goal was to get bin Laden by any means necessary, whether that meant capturing him alive or killing him. And bin Laden was able to seek refuge in Afghanistan because the Mujahideen insurgents, which the United States has supported in their fight against the Soviet Union, they had become the Taliban, and they had gradually taken over control of Afghanistan. And the Taliban, they were a Islamic fundamentalist organization. They were Sunni Muslim, like bin Laden was, and so they became allies with Al Qaeda. They didn't like the Shiite Muslims of Iran, and I should also add that some of the Mujahideen actually broke off, and they formed the Northern Alliance, which was in the northern part of Afghanistan, and it did not support the radicalism of the Taliban. The U.S. invaded Afghanistan in October of 2001 to defeat al-Qaeda, eliminate bin Laden, and remove the Taliban from power, and replace them with a more democratic government that would extend more rights and liberties to the Afghan people. Bin Laden was eventually killed by an elite Navy SEAL team in Pakistan on May 2nd of 2011, and the U.S. military withdrew the last troops from Afghanistan in the summer of 2021, leading to the Taliban taking control of the country and a U.S. defeat in the region. Afghanistan has been called the graveyard of empires because world empires across history have struggled in the region, whether it was Alexander the Great's empire in antiquity, whether it was the British in the 19th century, or the Soviets in the 20th century, and of course the U.S. in the 21st century. And although the U.S. has withdrawn from Afghanistan, the war on terror continues, making it the longest continuous war in U.S. history. Fighting against insurgents, the U.S. military struggled in Afghanistan's rocky, mountainous environment in much the same way that previous empires, like the Soviets, struggled, having a technological advantage, but being on the back foot, being an invading force in a hostile and very ethnically divided country. There's many different ethnic groups in Afghanistan. There are various warlords that rule parts of the country. It's a very complex situation. It's not like trying to occupy Germany or Japan after World War II. It's even in many ways quite different than the U.S. occupation of South Vietnam during the Vietnam War. But Vietnam casts a long shadow in American military history and foreign policy history. And initially, U.S. Defense Secretary under Bush, Donald Rumsfeld, his plan was to not send a very large force to Afghanistan, keep a very small, elite, but very well-trained and really experienced U.S. military force in the region, and really try to win over the hearts and minds of the Afghan people and overawe and destroy the enemy using superior technology, including drones and aircraft. And this strategy, while it's understandable considering the Vietnam War experience, it really did not work in Afghanistan. The U.S. had better results when they had more boots on the ground in Afghanistan, but that would lead to higher American casualties and more resentment from the Afghan people. And the troop surge I'm referencing was the 2009 troop surge, which actually took place at the beginning of the Obama presidency. And Barack Obama, for all of his talk of being a very different type of executive than Bush, and in many ways he was, not only in his style but in his substance, he largely continued the war on terror using the same tactics and strategies of his predecessor. He basically deferred to his cabinet and then to military professionals, which generally is the wisest thing to do if you're a executive and you have a limited experience on an issue, especially military issues. You know, Bush had some military service in the Air National Guard during the Vietnam War era. He was stateside. Obama, however, did not have military service in his past, so he, I think, wisely decided to defer to the experts on the subject of warfare. Although many of Obama's more left-leaning supporters felt that this was a betrayal of his campaign promises and why they elected him. And another pattern for all of his bluster of doing things differently and promising to redefine American foreign policy, President Donald Trump largely continued existing strategies in Afghanistan as well. And it was during the presidency of Joe Biden, former vice president of Barack Obama, that something different was attempted, and that was the Afghan withdrawal, which, of course, did not go the way the Biden administration envisioned it would have. And the Taliban and Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, they did receive some foreign support from other nations in the region, like Pakistan, which officially was supposed to be an ally of the United States, and from Iran, a radical Islamic theocratic nation that shared borders with Afghanistan. But they did not receive the kind of support that the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong received during the Vietnam War, yet the Taliban were eventually able to essentially wear down the United States and achieve victory by 2021. And over 2,400 Americans have died fighting in Afghanistan over the course of about 20 years, from 2001 to 2021. And 20,000 have been wounded. And the war on terror, though, is not confined to Afghanistan. Other nations were going to be involved in the war on terror as well. And here are some images of the end of the U.S.-Afghan war. These images were from about August 30th of 2021, and as U.S. forces left their bases in a very, some might say, rushed manner, if you're being more critical of the withdrawal, there were Afghan civilians and members of the Afghan military and government who had supported the United States who also tried to flee the country as well, because they feared, and rightfully so, that they would face retaliation from the Taliban once the Taliban took control of the country. And of course, these images were very striking and shocking, particularly to Americans who lost family members who died in the withdrawal. But also, these images have echoes of the end of the Vietnam War as well, when South Vietnam fell to North Vietnam. Although South Vietnam survived for about 2 years after U.S. troops officially left the country, whereas Afghanistan really collapsed in a matter of hours and days from the U.S. retrograde. Iraq was a major site of conflict during the War on Terror as well. In 2002, President Bush described an axis of evil that had descended upon the world and that featured several nations, including Iraq and North Korea, that were supporting terrorist organizations and that were making the world a more dangerous place by building up weapons of mass destruction, be they chemical weapons, biological weapons, or possibly even nuclear weapons. As part of the terms of the end of the first Gulf War, Saddam Hussein was allowed to remain in power in Iraq, but he would have to permit United Nations weapons inspectors to come into the country and inspect his weapons stocks in order to make sure that he was not creating weapons of mass destruction, particularly nuclear weapons, which would be a very dangerous threat, not only to the Iraqi people, because in many cases Saddam was using weapons against his own ethnic minorities in his country, the Kurds in the north, the Shiites in the southeast. And there was concern that he might use those weapons not only against his own people, but against other nations in the region, like Saudi Arabia or like Israel. And while Saddam definitely had chemical weapons and very likely had biological weapons as well, we don't believe that he had nuclear weapons. And perhaps he, at certain points, may have tried to make nuclear weapons. We found no evidence that his scientists and weapons engineers had made any significant progress towards creating nuclear weapons. That's not to say, though, that Saddam Hussein would not have wanted nuclear weapons, or that had there been no weapons inspections at all in the decade or so between the first Gulf War and the Iraq War, that had there not been certain deterrents in place, that maybe he would not have tried to. I'm certainly not saying that he was a good man or a democratic leader or a fair leader by any stretch of the imagination, but the belief that there were weapons of mass destruction, including nuclear weapons, includes a lot of fabrications, we'll say. And the U.S. and Britain had made preemptive airstrikes against Iraq in the years between the first Gulf War and the 2003 Iraq War. And the most aggressive neoconservatives in the Bush administration, people like Vice President Dick Cheney, for example, they saw Iraq as not just a military threat and a violator of international norms, but as an almost existential threat to the United States. Saddam Hussein seemed to represent really all the evils of the Soviet Union and of Nazi Germany and of Islamic fundamentalism, all kind of rolled together, although Saddam Hussein himself was not a Islamic fundamentalist. And as part of the larger war on terror, and as part of fighting the axis of evil, the U.S. will invade Iraq in 2003 with the assistance of a coalition of other nations. The Iraq War eventually would prove much more controversial for the United States because those weapons of mass destruction simply were not found. In the end, the United States struggled with nation building in Iraq in a similar way that they did in Afghanistan. Iraq's geography is much less mountainous, which makes traversing the country a bit easier. Iraq has very bountiful resources, oil fields, in the same way that Afghanistan has poppy farms and mines. But Iraq is also very ethnically divided, much like Afghanistan is. There is a Sunni Arab majority in the country. There is a sizable Shiite Arab minority, which often will make alliances with Iraq because Iraq is a Shiite state. There are the Kurds in the northern part of the country who essentially are trapped between the Turks to their northwest and the Iraqis to their southeast. And many of these ethnic groups will be allies in the United States, most notably the Peshmerga army of the Kurds. But while the U.S. was able to exploit these ethnic divisions, really in some ways very similarly to how the United States does this with the various Native American powers in the American West, these ethnic divisions are also going to be a problem when it comes to nation building, as it's going to make it very difficult to set up a representative democratic government in Iraq, a struggle that they had in Afghanistan as well. But Saddam Hussein will eventually be captured in a bunker by the United States. He'll be taken alive, and he'll be sentenced to death by an Iraqi court in December of 2006, or rather he was executed in December of 2006. And throughout this period, the U.S. military and its own native local allies and its coalition allies will struggle against Iraqi insurgents. There were a variety of insurgents in the country. There were members of the Ba'ath Party, Baath Party, who were staunch supporters of Saddam Hussein. There was the Republican Guard, which in many ways were essentially Saddam Hussein and his family's private army. There were militias like the Fedayeen that continued to fight against the coalition forces even after Saddam had been thrown out of power. And there were various Sunni and Shiite militias as well. And these militias, these militants, they fought against the U.S. military. They fought against the Iraqi army that was allied with the United States. They fought against the Iraqi police as well. And you really see this in a series of battles. The most notable battles are the first and second battles of Fallujah that took place in the spring and fall of 2004. The first Battle of Fallujah was fought because U.S. contractors had been killed and their bodies had been dragged through the streets, really in a way that was reminiscent to the Black Hawk Down situation in 1993. The U.S. military attacked Fallujah. They were supposed to be helped by Iraqi police and military forces, but these forces basically withdrew from the battle and left the fighting to the United States. And the first Battle of Fallujah really in many ways was a defeat for the United States. But the second battle was more successful. In the second battle, the U.S. coalition announced to the people of Fallujah that there was going to be a battle in their city, and civilians fled the city, which minimized civilian casualties. So the second battle of Fallujah went better for the United States. And in addition to Iraqi forces that we were allied with, we also had British forces that took part in these Fallujah battles. The greatest killer of American troops in Iraq was not enemy insurgents or terrorists or militants or in some cases you might even just say people who were just fighting against an invading enemy. The greatest killer of American troops in the Iraq War was IEDs, improvised explosive devices, which in some cases were locally made and then planted by local militants. In other cases, they were actually made by Iran and imported into the country. So again, the enemies of the United States in Iraq are receiving assistance from other countries in the same way that the Afghans were receiving assistance from other countries. And the U.S. will struggle with nation building and occupation in Iraq. There will be a troop surge in 2007, which the successes of the troop surge in 2007 led to more stability in the country. And after the surge was completed, the overall U.S. casualty rate actually did go down. So more boots on the ground did improve the situation in the country. But troop surges were very unpopular, particularly domestically in the United States, because that meant more Americans having to be deployed in Iraq. The U.S. does not have a rolling draft in this period. We did away with our regular draft in the years following the Vietnam War. We still have the selective services system, so if the United States were to ever get into a World War III type of situation, they would bring back a draft for that. But the kind of Cold War era regular draft that we had in the past had been done away with. So this meant we would have to take additional troops from the National Guard and from the reserves, which could lead to lower morale in the U.S. military. And also it was an unpopular decision with American civilians who didn't want to see their family members sent away to harm's way in Iraq. And the U.S. will remove its troops from Iraq in 2011, but they will have to be redeployed in the country in 2014 during the administration of Barack Obama, and that was to deal with the threat of the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, or the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, often known as ISIS or ISIL. And ISIS was a radical Islamic organization that was not only a terrorist group that committed human rights abuses against against Christians, against Jews, and against other Muslims that disagreed with them. But they were trying to build a Islamic caliphate that cut across multiple other nations. And ISIS rose in 2011, really in some ways as part of the Arab Spring. And the Arab Spring was a series of popular uprisings and really in some ways democratic movements that rose up across the Middle East in places like Egypt and in Libya and in Syria. And they were acting against the autocratic dictators that ruled those countries, whether it was um, Muammar Gaddafi in Libya, Hosni Mubarak in Egypt, or Bashar al-Assad in Syria. And those dictators are very autocratic, but they were really less religious than many people in their population. And in some ways, they were somewhat friendly with the United States. Gaddafi being a bit of an exception, he had supported terrorist organizations against the United States in the 1980s. But these men were certainly not good, but they did provide some stability. You might have even said the same thing about Saddam Hussein before he was ultimately removed from power and executed. ISIS was largely defeated by 2017, although there's pockets of ISIS resistance in this part of the world, and there are other ISIS cells in places like sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia as well. And as I said before, the war on terror is ongoing. Well, you might argue that the United States has left its nation-building phase of the war on terror. The fighting continues, terrorism attacks continue, and over 10,000 Americans have died in the war on terror, and hundreds of thousands of people around the world have died in these conflicts and interventions. The war on terror has loomed large in American society, and in many ways the fight against terrorism in the new millennium has taken on a role in American politics and culture that the Cold War occupied from the late 1940s to 1991. We went from opposing communism and communists and the Soviet Union and its allies to opposing terrorism from a variety of nations and opposing the so-called axis of evil nations, countries like Iraq, Iran, and North Korea. Although we also face more conventional opponents too, like Russia and very likely China in future years. And the war on terror was the primary focus in American foreign policy throughout the 2000s, but it also was a major factor in domestic policy as well. And while the Bush presidency is remembered for the war on terror, the Afghanistan war, the Iraq war, people often forget about many of the domestic policies that the Bush administration supported to deal with the threat of terror at home within the United States. Some scholars have argued that really the Bush administration expanded the U.S. government significantly, really expanded the government in a way that had not been seen since the 1930s with the New Deal. And they would point to legislation like the Patriot Act of October of 2001, which gave the United States a lot more latitude in observing and you might say spying on the communications of people within the United States. Officially, this was done to preemptively discover terrorist plots and attacks because the September 11th attacks had been planned for years, right under our nose. I think, again, it wasn't that we didn't know about those attacks, it was the lack of communication between government agencies. And the Patriot Act is part of what it does is it tries to make it easier for local law enforcement and various government intelligence agencies to communicate with each other. But critics of the Bush administration of the Patriot Act said that basically it was a form of violation of the constitutional rights of American citizens, particularly Americans' Fourth Amendment rights, our rights to not be having to deal with unlawful searches and seizures, that people who had not been convicted of crimes or had not been issued proper warrants, they could have their communications be spied on, essentially. I would also argue, and this is more my own personal belief, that when you know the government can be listening in on you, it's also a form of censorship. It's really a form of self-censorship. you won't say things that you would have otherwise said if you believe that third parties might be listening in on you. Other legislation that was supported by the Bush administration domestically to combat terrorism. The Department of Homeland Security, DHS, was established in 2002, and it's still active today. And I would also point to the establishment of the Transportation and Security Administration, which was set up actually in November of 2001, and it was set up to provide additional security for travelers who are flying, because there was a lot of fear after 9/11 about getting on aircraft, and the aircraft industry saw a massive decline in the number of people that wanted to fly, and these airlines essentially, many of them came very close to going out of business because of the September 11th attacks and the fear that Americans felt and other people across the world felt about traveling. And the TSA, you can debate how effective they've been at catching suspected terrorists, but it did help people feel more reassured and feel safer when they flew. Although many of the screening procedures that we have to go through can certainly be very annoying. And domestic politics that were not related to the war on terror, but were related to economic issues, they become much more salient in the final months of the Bush administration, particularly after the beginning of the 2008 financial crisis. But his successors are also going to deal with some very serious economic challenges, as well as some foreign policy challenges too. And I'm speaking in broad strokes here because at the school I teach, we don't really do much historical discussion past the early 21st century. So to kind of wrap up Bush, I'll talk a bit more about his domestic policies and his overall personality and his relationship with the media. Bush saw himself as the compassionate conservative, and the way he spoke about marginalized people really fit with that image. He really believed he was helping working class people who had not had a fair shake at life. I want to remind my readers again that for this final video for AMH 2020, I'm speaking in very broad terms about American politics and culture and society in the 1980s, 2000s, and beyond. And this is because of the way American history courses are set up at the institution where I teach. And it's also because when you're talking about events within 20 years, it can be difficult to talk about them in a nonpartisan and objective manner, not only because the historian has lived through those events themselves, but because these things are still playing out. And so I'm talking about bigger, broader trends here, and I'm using pop culture as kind of a window to consider these developments. I'll begin by talking about some famous television shows that are from this period. And one of the first big trends is Generation X. They're maturing. They are becoming adults. Some of them would have voted for their first presidential election in 1984, but by the 1990s, they are getting into their careers. They are getting into better jobs. Some of them are buying homes. Some of them are getting married and having children. The thing is, though, they are getting married later in life. It is taking them longer to find their careers. They're spending more time in things like higher education, like college, as the college attendance rate does increase over time, and it actually will hit its peak with the millennial generation. They have been called the most educated generation in American history. We millennials may not always seem very educated or sound very educated, but the stats would show that college attendance was highest amongst our generation, and it's actually been on decline amongst Generation Z for a variety of reasons. And the millennial generation is going to be very influential on American politics and culture and society, especially from the late 2000s and early 2010s on. And the millennial generation, we were born in the early 1980s, 1981, 1982, until about 1996. That's usually the cutoff date for the millennial generation. And we've been called the first, or rather, we are a transitional generation between Generation X and Generation Z. And the millennial generation, of course, was a bigger generation than Gen X and Gen Z. And this is because millennials, by and large, are the children of the baby boomers, who were themselves the biggest generation in American history. And the trend of adulthood taking a bit longer to start, that's been increasing across the post-World War II years. Teenagers became an important demographic in American culture and American economics and marketing after World War II. Teenagers had always been around, but now they had a unique group identity and a unique group subculture, or many subcultures within teenagerhood. And something similar happens with the youngest baby boomers and with the oldest Gen Xers. And you really see this in television shows like Seinfeld and Friends. And Seinfeld started in 1989, technically in the 80s, but it ran for 9 seasons. In many ways, it was the definitive 1990s show. When people think 90s culture, they think Seinfeld. And the cast of Seinfeld, they were the oldest baby boomers, but they're part of that late boomer Generation Jones group that has a very different experience with life than the older boomers. And the show is all about young adulthood and not settling down, not getting married, and having casual, serial sexual relationships. And it really reflects the fact that young adulthood is becoming a new demographic. Just as teenagers became a new demographic after World War II, young adulthood becomes a new demographic in the closing years of the 20th century. In some ways, this is because of the sexual revolution. It's more permissible to have sexual relationships outside of marriage, to not settle down. It is a factor, I think, of declining religiosity as well. Traditional religions, especially Christianity, generally encourage marriage and having children, but this new generation is doing things a bit different. But it's also economic as well. Settling down and starting a family is getting increasingly difficult with time. Interest rates are very high in the 1980s, and that makes purchasing homes more expensive, and overall home prices do increase with time in the United States. And it takes more education and more experience to get jobs, and there's economic factors along with social factors that would lead to this young adult demographic emerging. And you see this with Generation X, and you're going to see it with millennials and Gen Z as well. And you see it with shows like Seinfeld, which were on in the 89 all the way through to 1998. You know, it's the 90s show. And you also see it with the show Friends as well, which was on from 1994 to 2004 and is also thought of as being a 90s show, although Friends is more about the oldest Gen Xers. The cast of Friends were a few years younger than the cast of Seinfeld, but in many ways they're a very similar demographic group. These later boomers, these early Gen Xers, they're putting off marriage, they're putting off having children. It's taking them longer to get established in their careers. And both of these shows, I think, were also different than the shows of, say, the 1970s. Seinfeld famously was the show about nothing. And its creators, like Larry David, said that it's the no lessons show. Unlike the shows in the 1970s, like All in the Family, which were very heavy on social commentary. There were occasional political jokes, like when Elaine dated a communist, for example, but the whole point was it was kind of weird and it was something to laugh about. It wasn't a sign of communist subversion in America. It was something you could poke fun about in the 1990s. And Friends generally was pretty light on social commentary as well. The show does feature David Schwimmer's character Ross, his wife coming out as a lesbian, and then getting married to a woman. It wasn't a legal marriage ceremony, but it was a symbolic marriage ceremony. And also he and Jennifer Aniston's character Rachel do have a child out of wedlock together. So you see new ideas about relationships, but it was generally light on social commentary for the most part. The most famous family sitcom of the 1990s, though, was not live action. It was a cartoon, and it was Fox's The Simpsons, which began in 1989, and I think it's still on today. They talk about canceling it every once in a while. I haven't watched the show in years. I don't know anybody who still watches it. It's not nearly as culturally relevant as it used to be. But The Simpsons, They're meant to portray a average, lower to central middle class family. Homer Simpson is the family patriarch, and he's really portrayed as a drunken, abusive idiot, choking his son Bart. And he's really portrayed a lot like the paterfamilias Archie Bunker in All in the Family. Really, Homer Simpson is an Archie Bunker type character, kind of like Peter Griffin in Family Guy, another adult-focused cartoon. And it really, this show reflects a different idea about the family and a different idea about gender norms that had gotten to be more part of American pop culture in the second half of the 20th century. And from a historical context, and this is a little bit weird to talk about because the show has been on for so long, but older viewers, Gen X viewers, when they watched The Simpsons, they were meant to think that Homer was kind of an idiot, a slob, a drunk. He's got a boring, dead-end job at the nuclear power plant, and we weren't really meant to sympathize with Homer Simpson. That's how Gen X viewers would have viewed Homer Simpson. But an interesting thing happens with younger viewers, whether it's millennials or Gen Z. They know about Homer Simpson. If they watch the show now, they would say, well, Homer Simpson's actually pretty cool. He actually can afford a house on a single income. He's got 3 kids, and he's got amazing job security. He doesn't jump around from one job to the next every couple of years. So as the American economy has gotten to be more competitive, as things like wealth disparities have increased with time, as the economy has become more globalized, as neoliberalism has become more salient in American economics and in culture as well, Homer Simpson went from being kind of a loser character to actually a very aspirational figure. And it really, in some ways, shows the challenges that younger generations, particularly millennials and Gen Z, are facing. So it's an interesting thing that I've noticed as a historian. Documentaries were also very popular in the turn of the millennium era. Documentaries like Ken Burns' historical documentary, The Civil War in 1990, Michael Moore's numerous political documentaries during this period. Um, they, inform viewers of important events, current events, and they educate people about history. And these documentaries also, they're going to lead to changes in how entertainment film is done. The popularity of educational documentaries will lead to the rise of mockumentaries. And mockumentaries are scripted television shows that are shot in the documentary style, featuring voiceover narrations, featuring talking head interviews with the characters that are written into the script of the show, instead of doing a sitcom where it's filmed before a live studio audience, the way television shows were shot prior to this period. Now there are still very popular shows that are shot before live audiences, studio-style shows, but the mockumentary style takes off because of documentaries, and they're popular to do because they're a really interesting and dynamic way to tell stories, and they are also cheaper to film, because you can use less expensive camera equipment, because in documentaries you use cheaper camera equipment because you're, hitting the bricks to get your B-roll film for the documentary. And one of my favorite early mockumentaries was the show Arrested Development. And I like the character interviews you see in mockumentaries, the fourth wall breaks that you see in mockumentaries. Fourth wall breaks are when characters on the show look into the camera and basically are addressing the audience. Mockumentaries, or rather Arrested Development, didn't have these talking head interviews, but it did have narration. It was on from 2003 to 2006. It offered some light social commentary, particularly on LGBT visibility and on the Iraq War and the War on Terror. But its social commentary was not nearly as ubiquitous as like the social commentary was in 1970s television shows. But I would say social commentary really increases in media as the late 2000s and 2010s begin, and will continue really into the 2020s. I would say the most famous and successful mockumentary of all time was The Office from NBC, and it ran from 2005 to 2013. And I cite The Office as a successful mockumentary, not only for its viewership and ratings, but really looking at the show as a historian, I think it's a very historically significant show. It captures some generational anxiety, it captures concerns about automation, and it also really shows what happens to the American workplace and, in some ways, the American economy as a whole as a result of computers, the internet, and really basically early forms of artificial intelligence. And I should add that it was originally based on a British mockumentary of the same name, which is also an interesting show, too. But The Office satirized life in the 2000s and early 2010s American workplace. And it shows how the internet, computers, eventually smartphones, and other technologies that were basically making most of office work obsolete. And this is a problem for Gen X workers who are getting to be older and are really getting to be, mature adults. But it's also posing a problem for millennials as well, as they realize that their jobs are unfulfilling, they don't do a lot of very interesting work, and that much of the work that they actually do can be done by automated technology, whether it's answering machines, whether it's an online website that replaces paper salesmen, and that leads to depression and worker dissatisfaction. That's why John Krasinski's character Jim is always playing tricks on Rainn Wilson's character Dwight, because Dwight takes his job very seriously. He has much more of a mid-century attitude about his work, whereas Jim has much more of a late 20th century, early 21st century Gen X millennial attitude that it's all kind of BS. And the relationship between the boss and the employees, Michael Scott, played by Steve Carell, it shows how business culture changed across the 20th century. The kind of jokes that Michael makes, particularly about his female employees, they were already on the edge in the late 20th century. But by the early 21st century, they are unacceptable. And Michael's character also is very interesting as well, because he's a very lonely, very solitary person. He doesn't want to be that way. So he really tries to turn his employees into his friends, whether they want to be or not. And that really represents the decline in civic engagement and in social networks in America that happens in the late 20th century. And some of that is downstream from declining religious service attendance as well. And declining religious service attendance does correlate with declining civic engagement and increasing atomization. And you see this trend in film as well. Movies about office and business culture. And I think The Office also does a pretty good job covering issues related to the 2008 financial crisis and the fallout of that event, as their company actually goes bankrupt, and then they begin hiring younger employees. At this point, it's millennials taking their first job, and the millennial workers have a real significant challenge integrating into the post-2008 recession workforce. I'll mention one more mockumentary here, and this is Modern Family, which ran from 2009 to 2020. So in some ways, it's kind of the sitcom of the 2010s. I mean, there's other significant sitcoms, but I think this one is probably the most significant in terms of the historical and family trends that it charts. And on the show Modern Family, it features Ed O'Neill as Jay Pritchett. He is the paterfamilias of the Pritchett family. O'Neill had previously played Al Bundy on the show Married with Children, and he kind of played a Archie Bunker type character on Married with Children, and he plays a Archie Bunker type character on Modern Family, sort of a old kind of curmudgeonly paterfamilias who's very politically incorrect. And one of the central plots of the show is basically his relationship with his second wife, Gloria, who's considerably younger than he is, and she's played by Sofia Vergara. And there's a lot of tension between his new wife, Gloria, and his daughter, Claire, played by Julie Bowen. And also there's some tension between his new wife and his son-in-law, Phil, played by Ty Burrell. Really, I think a very, very, very funny, very interesting show. And the show also featured a openly gay couple, the father, Jay's son, Mitchell, played by Jesse Tyler Ferguson, who actually was gay in reality. He plays alongside Eric Stonestreet, who was actually heterosexual in outside of the camera. And these characters, they adopt a child from Vietnam named Lily, and eventually they actually do get married during the show. The actors on the show, not in real life. The show reflects changes to LGBT issues in America, the legalization of gay marriage nationwide. It had some social commentary, but was generally pretty light on the social commentary. It was not in every single episode. But social commentary becomes more and more salient in American media in the 2010s and into the 2020s. I suspect, though, and this is very recent current events trends, I suspect social commentary will be less prominent in American media in the second half of the 2020s, but we'll see what happens there. And the show Modern Family, of course, featuring openly gay characters. It built on earlier very successful LGBT-focused shows like Will and Grace from 1998 to 2006, and then it had actually a revival from 2017 and 2020. And leaders in the gay rights and LGBT movement have said that things like protests and legal changes are of course very significant, but media representation is just as important for the gay rights movement, if not more so. Reality television also became a major part of American media in the early millennium, in the 2000s and into the 2010s. I don't think reality television is as important now in the 2020s because of social media. We have reality television in our back pockets nowadays. In 2007 and 2008, there was a writers' strike. A lot like the strike actually for writers that took place in 2023. In 2023, they were striking over AI and over how writers will be compensated for streaming. In 2007 and 2008, they were striking about how internet distribution revenue would be met out. Early forms of streaming that were beginning to emerge in the late 2000s. And the writers' strike, it led to the rise in unscripted television, or reality television as it's often called. And I say unscripted because really reality television is not reality. You had the original version of American Idol, which was on from 2002 to 2016. Again, some of these shows did predate the writers' strike of 07 to 08, but the desire and demand for reality or unscripted television will increase after 08, largely due to the writers' strike and also the 2008 financial crisis. Everyone was looking to do things more cheaply, and these unscripted shows are cheaper to shoot. You don't have to write them, meaning you don't have to hire script writers. They can be done very cheaply. And there was a novelty about them in the late 2000s and early 2010s, which definitely by this point really has worn off. You had shows like Jersey Shore from 2009 to 2012, which featured Italian-American people from New Jersey who, in many cases, they were not a good representation at all of Italian-American culture. But they were very idiosyncratic and crazy people, so there was a level of entertainment when you watch these shows. Again, these shows are not really reality; they're unscripted. In the same way that the Toddlers and Tiara show, which featured families having their 2, 3, 4, 5-year-old children in beauty pageants. I don't think those shows accurately represented Southern culture. They represented a small subculture within a much larger region. But the idea is these shows are engrossing and they're interesting even if they're not really the real world. And then you have shows like The Kardashians, Keeping Up with the Kardashians, which ran from 2007 to 2021 and was a significant show because of Kris Jenner's relationship to the O.J. Simpson trial back in the 1990s. Her scandal-prone children, most notably her daughter Kim, provided a lot of material, we'll say, for reality television. And then her husband, Bruce Jenner, famous Olympic athlete, his transition into Caitlyn Jenner certainly fit with the cultural zeitgeist of the 2010s, and that was in the later years of the show. But again, reality television took off in the late 2000s in large part because of the writers' strike of '07 to '08 and the '08 financial crisis. And while reality television still exists today, and there's been spin-offs of the shows I've mentioned before, there's been revivals of the shows I've mentioned before, in many ways it's largely been supplanted by social media and by YouTube, TikTok, etc., which essentially are reality shows created by the actual creators, cutting out the studio middlemen. As I've said throughout this course, fashion is a useful indicator of social change, economic change, of political movements. So we'll talk a bit about how fashion changed in the late 20th century and early 21st century, and really use this as a kind of a barometer, a measurement of where culture and where politics and where the economy is going during this period. And again, I'm speaking in very broad strokes here. Consumer culture in the 90s and 2000s was heavily impacted by the innovative technologies that were becoming prolific in the new millennium. The internet and the people's access to it via the World Wide Web, and especially as personal computers became cheaper, as internet service became cheaper, and then as smartphones and social media developed toward the end of the 2000s. Fashion trends and fads are going to come and go quickly than ever before, and this is an argument that I make as someone who studies history and who pays attention to fashion, and also I've seen it being made in leading media publications. There was actually an interesting article in The Atlantic about this. I'll put it in the description of this video, but technology and social media and mass media initially led to more change and more dynamism in fashion and periods of fashion, and people being more individualistic and having more individuality in what they wore. But they've also argued in recent years the proliferation of social media, the proliferation of smartphones and the internet has actually kind of moved in the opposite direction. It's actually made fashion and popular culture, believe it or not, more homogeneous and less susceptible and less responsive to change. So basically fashion went from being more responsive to change during this period thanks to new technologies, and then eventually it kind of finished up by being less responsive to change. So when people talk about how everything is terrible in the 2020s and the fashion isn't as good and everything just seems to be terrible, they're not just speaking out of turn or speaking based on nostalgia. There's actually some good evidence to back that up, especially when it comes to fashion. But I'll start by saying that in the early 90s, fashion had some similar trends that you saw in the late 1980s, but things actually get to be a lot more subdued and muted. You see this in things like the grunge style, which you can see on this slide here. And this is because, Generation X, Gen Xers are growing a bit older. As you get older, you prefer more conservative styles. Not necessarily conservative politically, but just you don't want to dress as out there. And also, the 90s economy was much more volatile than the economy was in the 80s. And people prefer more muted clothing during periods of recession and periods of economic uncertainty. Again, more muted clothing styles are what is often called in fashion studies a recession indicator. There's also a bit of nostalgia in the grunge style too. They're kind of referencing some 60s and 70s fashion trends, in addition to dealing with recession indicators in the 1990s. In the mid 90s, fashion for women and men it becomes more glamorous. The economy it gets better across the 1990s, and people are spending more money on clothing. There's more choice, and again, there's an international emphasis on fashion. People will copy, what they're seeing on television and in film, and what's being worn around the world. There's Asian influences in 90s fashion as a result of globalization and U.S. business relationships that are really exploding between Japan and the U.S. and China and the U.S. in the 1990s. There's a bit of a British invasion as well, as many young women copy the styles of the British pop group, the Spice Girls, and I actually think that fashion in the middle of the 90s gets to be a bit more formal as well. And a lot of this reflects globalization and a volatile and dynamic American economy in the 1990s. There's periods of recession where you see darker, more muted colors, and there's periods of a bit more economic growth where you actually see more of an exuberance when it comes to fashion. And fashion changes significantly in the early 2000s. 9/11 takes place in 2001, and this led to some pretty significant fashion changes. There was a recession in the wake of 9/11. It's actually estimated the economy lost about 2 trillion with a T dollars in value just because of the fear and uncertainty that came as a result of those attacks. And again, you see darker, more muted colors becoming more popular in recessions. But there also were social and cultural factors that changed fashion after 9/11. Denim and camouflage and workwear became very popular and became much more accepted at even in more formal settings. And celebrities, they wore denim, they wore camouflage to show their patriotism, to show their support for the U.S. military, to show that they were patriotic and hardworking. Everybody wore T-shirts with flags on them, especially the American flag. And it was a period where patriotism and Americana and support for the military became very salient in fashion. And this is in the early 2000s. This is largely downstream from the events of 9/11. There's a push for support for the military, support for America, and for patriotism and for unity as well. Things changed, though, in the mid to late 2000s. There was a lot of consensus in the early 2000s in America because of the war on terror, but that begins to disappear certainly after the mid 2000s and into the later 2000s as the American public grows more fatigued with the war on terror, especially the war in Iraq. Um, American popular culture, and as well as the culture of other countries, came actually in some cases to be very critical of the war on terror and of the Bush administration, the so-called redneck agenda, and the American idiots, in the words of the sort of pop punk band Green Day. And in the mid 2000s, a lot of urban styles, especially African American inspired styles, were common. But as the late 2000s continues, you start to see emergence of punk-inspired styles, especially the so-called emo style, which in many ways it grows out of punk culture, which was meant to be sort of anti-American or at least anti-U.S. American foreign policy culture. So a lot of younger people that were frustrated with the political direction the country was going in the late 2000s and inspired by their favorite pop punk bands, they embraced the emo style. I think the emo style also grew up as a result of increased awareness about mental illness, too. That mental illness was not just something that you should hide and keep secret, but it was something that you could be honest and open about. And that by doing that, you could eventually get the help you needed. I think, though, in some ways, this perhaps may have gone a bit too far to the point where, in some cases, people's mental illness almost became their identity. And that would lead to things like self-diagnosis and instead of getting professional help that you need going to people online or going to your friends, people who are not trained mental health professionals. There also was a bit of a 80s revival in the mid to late 2000s as well. You see this in some of the fashion choices that people wore during this period, especially things like costume jewelry, for example. And this was because fashion kind of works on a 20-year cycle. If you buy something and you don't like it, put it in the back of your closet because in 20 years it'll be cool again. Then the 2008 financial crisis happened, and again, darker, more muted, simpler color palettes begin to emerge. And you really see this with a Silicon Valley tech style. People like Mark Zuckerberg wearing just a pair of jeans and a gray t-shirt. Never mind that his t-shirt costs hundreds and hundreds of dollars. But they start to copy these simpler styles because of economic problems related to the 2008 crisis, and then because some of the wealthiest, most influential people in the country who are part of a very dynamic, changing tech economy in Silicon Valley, this is how they dress, so it becomes much more acceptable to just wear a t-shirt and a pair of jeans, or even just a sweatshirt and a pair of jeans or khakis or something, even to places like work. The idea is that tech workers can dress more informally, and that leads to workers in other fields dressing more informally as well. And there's also the idea, too, that the really smart, talented, unique people, they don't need to wear suits to work. They don't need to look really professional in the workplace. They're so smart that they can wear whatever they want. They can look unusual. They don't have to follow middle class standards of beauty and things like that. And in some ways, I think that's an inclusive thing. But in other ways, I think it can lead people to problems. And I think it actually led people, because people make decisions based on how people look, even if they say they don't, it led to people supporting people like, say, Sam Bankman-Fried in the early 2020s. Sam Bankman-Fried, he looked almost like a parody of Zuckerberg and of tech billionaires, and they thought, well, if he looks like kind of a schlub, he must be an absolute genius. And really, he wasn't a genius. He was actually stealing people's money, and they trusted a man that they shouldn't because he seemed to be leaning into this Silicon Valley overly informal style that really began to take root in the late 2000s. In the early to mid 2010s, nostalgia and irony were major features in American fashion. Particularly, this is often called the hipster style. Hipster actually comes from the term hepster. Hepster meant someone in the 1930s that lived in an urban center and liked jazz music. Eventually, the term hep was replaced with hip. And the hipster style, though, by the 2010s, it meant someone who basically wore very nostalgic, early 20th century inspired fashion. Again, nostalgia and copying earlier generations' styles. This is a big part of fashion. It can happen on 20-year cycles, but with the hipsters, they were copying much, much older styles. They were copying early and mid 20th century styles with a 21st century twist, of course. And the twist that the 2010s hipsters put on their nostalgic style was irony. And why irony? Why base an entire aesthetic around irony? Well, a lot of this is downstream of the 2008 financial crisis, and it's downstream of the response that many younger people, millennials who were trying to enter the job market in the 2010s felt. The anger they felt, the frustration they felt that they couldn't find a decent job, that they had student loans they had to pay off, that rent was very expensive, that the best jobs in the country at this period in the 2010s, they were largely in Silicon Valley and in East Coast urban centers, places that were very cool and trendy to live, but very expensive to live in because there were, so many people flocking to go live there, and there was a lot of basically what you would see is sub-inflation or inflation in these smaller areas, and also gentrification as well as in some cases older industrial areas that in some cases had faced urban decay in the 20th century, they became very popular and in demand to live for these, millennial college graduates who are getting jobs in tech. Jobs that often pay very well, but you have a lot of student loan debt you're trying to pay off. You have high rent you're trying to pay off, and this gentrification can lead to urban renewal, but it can also be can cause a lot of problems for communities that already live in these big cities, especially in some cases elderly communities that are on fixed incomes, minority communities as well that now are paying higher property taxes and higher rent, but are not, getting these higher paying tech jobs. So this gentrification, this urbanization, moving to the big city, encouraged people to try out new types of fashion, and people wore older types of clothing because it was ironic. Millennials were young adults, yet they were dressing like their grandparents. As Newsweek said during this period, who knew Grandpa could be so chic? But it was ironic because, you might dress like Grandpa. You might wear his horn-rimmed glasses, his plaid shirt. You might dress, in a beanie hat and a Carhartt jacket, to look like a working man, but you were a white-collar tech worker. And, your grandfather might have conservative political views and different ideas about LGBT people, whereas you're very politically liberal and you are a big supporter of then President Barack Obama. So you're kind of almost cosplaying as older conservative people that you don't really like. There's a weird sense of irony that was in the hipster fashion sense. Look how ironic it is that, I'm a white collar tech worker, but I dress like a blue collar worker. Look how ironic it is that I'm, wearing fashion from the 1940s, and that's a period when African Americans couldn't vote, women didn't have the opportunities they have now. Isn't that ironic? And of course, it's also an impact of gentrification. It's thrift shop clothing that originally had been cheap, but now is very expensive because it's become trendy. Hairstyles were vintage inspired, or they were very androgynous. Young women cutting their hair short, men growing their hair long, wearing a wide-brimmed hat, even if you live in a place like Seattle where there's very little sun. It's all about nostalgia and irony, and you really see this with the millennials that are becoming young adults in the early to mid 2000s. It's the economic challenges they're facing, trying to find jobs. It's partially the Occupy Wall Street movement, where there's anger at the so-called 1%, anger at the people in power, politically, anger at the older generations, yet copying their style in kind of a sort of a weird, ironic way. Even in some ways, the patriotism that you had seen in the early 2000s became kind of passé and ironic. Hipsters in the 2010s used to say things like America, America without the A on the front, 'cause it sounded like how, older people would say America, particularly older people from like, rural areas in the South and Midwest. People that you often, as a, millennial, hipster, urban person that you thought were less sophisticated than you were, that were not getting with the times, that did not support gay marriage and did not support President Barack Obama. I actually think there was a little bit of this hipster ironic trend as well on the right side of politics among some conservatives as well, who liked older fashion because they had a very, you might say, sentimental view of the past. You can see this in the Tea Party movement, which emerged a little bit before the Occupy Wall Street movement. The Tea Party movement was angry at a lot of the same things the Occupy Wall Street movement was angry about. Occupy Wall Street was angry about bailouts for big banks and for automakers and for wealthy people having a golden parachute, whereas middle class and working class Americans were losing their homes. The Tea Party movement was angry about a lot of the same things as well, but Occupy Wall Street would have said that we need more government intervention, we need more regulations to close wealth disparities. The Tea Party movement would have said the government is the reason why we have these wealth disparities, why we have these bailouts. We need less government. So you actually see people across the political spectrum recognizing some of the same problems in American politics and society. They're recognizing the pitfalls of neoliberal economics. There's anger about the continued war on terror, about neoconservative foreign policy, and younger people and older people, regardless of their politics, they're kind of coming to very similar conclusions. And you're going to see the rise of populism in the mid 2010s and beyond, in the form of people like Bernie Sanders on the left and Donald Trump on the right. And fashion is clothing, but sometimes fashion even affects people's food choices as well. The millennial hipster types, they liked irony. They like to either eat very healthy, things like avocado toast, special coffees from Starbucks that were often very expensive. But they also in some ways liked to cosplay as working class people, even working class people that they might not like, in their food choices as well. Eating, burgers, a working class food, on a metal tray, and washing it down with craft beer, because beer was for the proletariat, or with PBR, Pabst Blue Ribbon. Even with things like body modifications and tattoos. Tattoos were supposed to be for sailors and working class people and bikers, but you have tech workers, both men and women, getting tattoos. Perhaps the most iconic hipster tattoo, though, was the mustache on the finger. Again, it's all about irony and dissatisfaction with the economy and with politics. People on the left picked this up with Occupy Wall Street, and people on the right picked it up with the Tea Party movement, and it led to the rise of populism by the mid-2010s. Towards the end of the 2010s and into the early 2020s, a new type of fashion emerges. It moves away from the vintage-inspired styles of the hipsters of the mid 2010s and early 2010s. There is an element of nostalgia here, but it's nostalgia for a much more recent period. It's really a bit of a nostalgia for 1990s grunge. It's sort of a grunge revival. It's baggier clothing. The hipster clothing of the 2010s generally was more tight-fitting. This style is often called normcore because it's really focused on so-called being normal, not wearing anything that's too colorful, too vibrant, too unusual. And I think this fashion choice, it reflects a couple of trends in the late 2010s and early 2020s. It reflects a new generation getting older and coming of age, Generation Z, and it reflects a greater degree of androgyny and trying to create more gender-neutral clothing that works for women, it works for men, and for people who may not identify with the so-called gender binary. And I also think it's reflective of the fact that people have other ways that they can express themselves now. People will wear more muted clothing because they can express themselves with the phone they use, the technology they use, with their social media pages. Also, they can express themselves not just with clothing, but with things like body modifications, tattoos, piercings. Things of that nature become increasingly socially acceptable as the 2010s go on and the 2020s begins. So your sartorial choice matters a bit less, and you can express yourself in other ways. And there's a focus on inclusivity as well, different genders, different body types. Some would say this is an impact of the body positivity movement. Sometimes it's even called the fat acceptance movement. The people who actually advance the body positivity movement, so-called, actually believe that the term fat should not be an insulting term, and that people who are overweight ought to refer themselves as fat and see that as a badge of pride. And while I think anorexia and people basically starving themselves is a very unhealthy thing, I think elements of this so-called body positivity movement could have a very serious health impact in the future, especially because the majority of the American adult population is overweight or obese at this point. As of 2025, it's nearly 75%. And as we get into the 2010s, we have the COVID-19 pandemic, we have increased working from home. That will lead to more casual styles as well because people are not going into the office. You wear a nice shirt and a sweater on the upper half of your body, but then you might wear a pair of pajama pants and slippers on the lower half of your body. There is very good evidence that the COVID pandemic changed fashion. And then after the COVID pandemic, we enter an economy which officially is not in a recession, but with inflation and with artificial intelligence being very disruptive to what were previously very high-paying white-collar tech jobs that would have been really, really in demand and very good in the 2010s during that hipster period. These jobs in many cases are disappearing. You're seeing people wear, more muted clothing because, again, recession indicators are muted clothing, longer skirts for people who want to wear skirts for women. And you see, capsule wardrobes, people wearing fewer clothing items because they're trying to be more practical and they're trying to save more money. And I think really by the 2020s as well, social media, people show off on social media. They don't show off so much with their clothing. And I think in a way, social media and smartphones, they go from encouraging new fashion trends and encouraging individuality to, in some ways, encouraging conformity. And we're really getting into recent times here, so I want to speak in very broad terms. But as I said, I think there's a push for conformity that is really taking hold in the 2020s. In some ways, this is because of economic challenges, but it's also, as I said, because of social media and because of everyone wanting to fit in and not do anything that's too risky or that's going to make them seem too unusual. And this has been called recession core. Again, recession and more muted colors and patterns, it becomes more of a thing. And it's meant to be versatile. It's meant to look professional. It's a return to business casual fashion. It's more of a formal way of dressing. But now you'll dress business casual not only when you go to work, your corporate fits, as some people call it today, but even when you're out on the town as well. Really, the idea is try to look like you have a job. Because if you look like you have a job, you'll be more likely to be offered, a better job because, we're dealing with a period where people are really struggling to find work, particularly if you're in the tech industry or if you're doing certain types of white collar work. AI has been very disruptive and a lot of people are losing their jobs or they're having to basically find ways to use AI to preserve the jobs they have. And this recession core style, it's being adopted not just by regular people, but you see it on television. The show Succession, I think, really shows this recession core style really well. And even with celebrities as well, who are not concerned about losing their jobs. They often dress like us regular little people. And this is something that you see really throughout history. It's called the Trianon effect. It comes from the term revolutionary. It comes from the time of Revolutionary era France, or really right before the Revolution. Marie Antoinette, the Queen of France, who was very famous for her lavish lifestyle, she set up a farm called the Petite Trianon, and there she would pretend to be a peasant. But she wasn't really a peasant, she was the queen, and she wasn't doing the kind of work peasants were doing. She would pretend to be a peasant for an hour or two each day. And the Trianon effect is something you see in many different cultures. And really, it's a sign of social decline because what happened a few years after Marie Antoinette was living on her Trianon farm, the French Revolution took place. And as I said, it's recession core, it's muted styles, it's safer, less risky styles, it's the quiet luxury trend. Sometimes the term office siren is used for women's fashion, office-inspired clothing, but it's really not what you would want to wear around the office. And finally, I think this 2020s fashion, there's a bit of a 2000s revival as well, because fashion's kind of on a 20-year cycle. And finally, I'll say that this recession core so-called trend that you're seeing in the 2020s, it's driven by a bit of nostalgia, largely because the oldest millennials by the 2020s are entering their 40s, are entering middle age. As you get older, you get more nostalgic, which is understandable. You're longing for essentially they're pining after a pre-COVID, pre-2008 financial crisis, even a pre-9/11 world, the world of their childhood. And Generation Z, I think, in some ways is doing this as well, for a world that they either never lived in because they were born too late, or they simply do not remember. As we come to an end to our discussion of America in the late 20th century and the early 21st century, I want to do a brief roundup on some of the major Supreme Court cases of the period. And these are cases that are decided by the Rehnquist Court and by the Roberts Court. John Roberts is the current Chief Justice of the Supreme Court as of 2025, and he was nominated for this position by President George W. Bush. On the whole, the Roberts Court, like the Rehnquist Court, has been considered a more conservative court in terms of its most impactful Supreme Court cases. And in their interpretation, the justices' interpretation of the Constitution. And the composition of the Supreme Court has gotten more conservative in recent years as justices have died or retired. That's the general analysis of the Roberts Court. And Roberts is often considered to be part of the conservative wing of the court, although I would say he's kind of in the middle between the more conservative members and the more liberal members, especially in recent years. We'll begin by talking about Shaw v. Reno from 1993. After 1990, the state of North Carolina redrew districts based on population, while also attempting to create new black majority districts to give African Americans additional representation in their state's politics. And this decision was actually in line with the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which mandated the government take a proactive role in protecting and promoting voting rights and representation of voters. In some ways, what the state of North Carolina was doing goes well beyond one person, one vote. And the U.S. government received the new congressional district maps and actually initially rejected the maps because they constituted gerrymandering, not because they were majority-minority districts. There's often a bit of misunderstanding about this case. And gerrymandering, of course, is when you draw districts for representative purposes, when they don't have the shape of a natural community. They're often very long, unusually shaped. This goes back to Elbridge Gerry and the early 19th century districts that were being drawn in the state of Massachusetts that looked rather strange, almost like a salamander, hence the term gerrymander. And of course, gerrymandering can be subjective, and to some degree, every political party will do this to increase their power, and one side's gerrymandering is another side's fair representation and updated districting or redistricting. And the district that particularly was in question was District 12. And that's not a Hunger Games reference. This was the District 12 that was proposed. It's a very long, thin district. Much of the district connects with local highways in the state, and so definitely a clear sign of gerrymandering. And a resident of District 12, whose name was Ruth Shaw and who was white, she actually sued because she was in this majority-minority district and felt that she was not represented by her district anymore because she was white, the majority of the people were black. She would have a harder time getting candidates that she liked to be elected. So she will sue Attorney General Janet Reno of the Clinton administration over the shape of her district, arguing that its gerrymandered shape violated her 14th Amendment equal protection rights, that basically her vote was being canceled out, and thus she was losing her voting rights. And in the end, the Supreme Court sided in favor of Ruth Shaw, 5-4, and that districts cannot be drawn solely based on race. And that was an important landmark Supreme Court case, but people will continue to make allegations like these for many years to come. And as of 2025, there are cases before the Supreme Court related to redistricting and possible racial considerations being used to make congressional districts. There also are events that are taking place in many states right now that are using 2020 census data to redraw their districts as well, and that often leads to controversy. As I said, one side's gerrymandering is another side's fair and updated redistricting. This is Lopez v. United States, 1995. In Texas, in San Antonio, a high schooler named Alfonso Lopez brought his revolver to school in 1992 with the plans of selling it. He was not going to engage in a school shooting, something that you see quite frequently in this period in American history, very sadly. And he was arrested and convicted on federal charges, and his case was appealed to the Supreme Court, and the court cited 5-4 in favor of Lopez, that the Commerce Clause of the Constitution did not negate students' Second Amendment rights. The Commerce Clause of the Constitution has been used in many cases related to schooling and education. The idea is education is good to have to create a economically competitive and productive society. It's good for interstate commerce to have an educated society, and therefore anything that is bad for education should be controlled or banned, whether it's certain firearm restrictions or in some cases there are proactive laws that favor education, that favor this Commerce Clause, such as compulsory education. That was something that was challenged by the Yoder v. Wisconsin case back in the 1970s. And this case, though, declared that the Second Amendment, basically the Second Amendment, the Bill of Rights, superseded or overrode the more nebulous interpretation of the Commerce Clause of the Constitution that was used to ban students from bringing firearms into school zones. And remember, he was not bringing the gun to school to engage in a school shooting or to wave it around and attack people. His plan was to sell it to someone else while meeting meeting at the school. And the case has led to an increase in federalism in federal and state legal cases. The idea that federal law does override state and local laws. That's the supremacy clause of the Constitution. The Second Amendment in the Bill of Rights, it's in the Constitution. It overrode any state and local laws that restricted firearm possession on school grounds. Granted, those laws did use interpretations of the Constitution to inspire their legislation. Since then, states have implemented their own gun-free zones policies, though. So it's not like you can now bring a gun to school after the Shaw, the Lopez v. U.S. case. But the point of Lopez v. U.S. is, one, increased use of federalism in state, federal legal cases, and then also you're seeing that the Supreme Court is beginning to make more cases that decide in favor of the Second Amendment and that strengthen the protections offered by the Second Amendment, which the Second Amendment across the 20th century, really up to the 1980s, as late as the 1980s, had, and into the 90s too, with the assault weapons ban of 1994, had basically constrained Second Amendment rights. But now, certainly with Lopez v. U.S., and up to the present, up to the 2020s, you've seen that protections in the Second Amendment have been strengthened, and you're going to see that in the next couple of cases. We'll talk about Bush v. Gore before we get to the gun control cases. And I discussed the details of this election previously in the video. Just remember that this was a very, very close election. It basically came down to the state of Florida. Florida is in two time zones, the Eastern time zone, which is what the peninsula of Florida is, and the panhandle of the state is in the Central time zone. And as I said, very, very close election. And it all came down to Florida. News networks, they want to call the election as quickly as possible because that looks really good. If you call a state early and you get it right, they began to call the state of Florida for Gore based on exit polls, interviewing people as they come out of the polls, asking them who they voted for, which can often be very unreliable. And they called the state for Gore, which the election was not over yet. The polls weren't even closed in the panhandle of the state 'cause it's an hour later there. Also, the panhandle of Florida at that time was much more conservative politically than other parts of the state. That's not really there's not as big of a difference between panhandle politics and peninsular politics nowadays in the 2020s, but back then. Um, the Panhandle was a much more conservative part of the state, with the exception of Leon County, the county that Tallahassee, the capital, is in. And so then the state's status was changed to too close to call, and as all the polls came in and were closed, the state actually went back in the direction of Bush, and it was within 1,000 votes. Very, very close election. And because of this, within Florida's own laws, this triggered a recount. Whenever it's a close election, there has to be a recount, but there are still very tight deadlines for when recounts must be completed. They must be completed by December, which is really not that much time. And not only were recounts being done, but hand recounts were being done as well, because every county, every voter precinct had different ways that they collected ballots, that the way people marked ballots. You could use pens, or you could use basically like a punch system, what were called hanging chads. And so it was very difficult to count these ballots and to determine if someone perhaps intentionally did not vote for the president but voted down ballot, or if they partially punched out a ballot. And there was a lot of debate within courts in Florida about what constituted a legal vote. And because of the time constraints, the Gore campaign called for a partial recount, a recount that only involved certain counties, and these were counties that were bluer, that were more for the Democratic Party, like Palm Beach County in South Florida. South Florida being a more liberal part of the state. Palm Beach County being not the most liberal of the South Florida counties. That's Broward County, but being a bit more liberal than Miami-Dade County, which has a large Cuban population who tend to be more conservative. Although the voting patterns of various Latino groups are always changing, and perhaps when I do eventually expand this video, I'll talk a bit more about Latino voters and some of the voting and demographic trends we see in the 20th century. In the end, though, the case did go to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court sided with Bush against Gore and upheld state laws. And their decision to do this was, one, to uphold state laws that were already in place, but also they used the 14th Amendment to justify their decision. They determined that by only doing a partial recount of certain counties, the Gore campaign was basically violating the equal protection under the law of the people who were in counties that were not being recounted. They're also in some ways violating the equal protection of people who perhaps wanted to vote down ballot but didn't want to vote for the president. They wanted to vote for everything else. That their vote, or their lack of vote, their undervote, matters just as much, and that their equal protection was being violated by having their ballots overly scrutinized and possibly thrown out. This was a very controversial decision. It was a 5-4 total decision. But the big meaty part of it, the 14th Amendment consideration, was actually 7-2 and was a bit less divided. Overall, polls at the time showed that while there was discontent at the fact that Bush had won the election without the popular vote, because Gore was winning in the popular vote, Bush went on to win with the Electoral College. Most Americans, not by a large margin, but a significant number, the majority did believe that the Supreme Court had acted fairly, calling the state of Florida for Bush. But people will feel very strongly about this case. They'll feel the Supreme Court made the wrong call. And really the reason why many people were upset with the Bush v. Gore decision, beyond the fact that it would lead to an electoral college victory, not a popular vote victory for Bush, but it was seen as being a partisan case, and it was seen as being a case that was a threat to an independent, nonpartisan judiciary. While our Supreme Court justices are chosen based on their case law, based on their jurisprudence, which will lean one way or the other, and they're nominated by U.S. presidents, they're supposed to officially be nonpartisan. It's not Chief Justice John Roberts R. at the end of his name because he was nominated by Bush, or because over time he's been more on the conservative side of the court. And they pointed to Sandra Day O'Connor, actually, Justice O'Connor, who was a Reagan appointee and who was a more conservative justice. She was not the most conservative justice, but one of the more center-right candidates. And they talked about how at an election night party that she was attending, she reacted to the state initially being called for Gore with disappointment and frustration. And then supposedly her husband, who was at the party with her as well, made a joke about how, oh, well, I guess we're going to have to stay in Washington, D.C. for 4 more years and we can't go retire to Arizona. The idea being that she wanted to make sure that she retired from the bench while there was a Republican president, because she would then be replaced by a more conservative justice. And was a rather dumb thing for her husband to say, I will admit. But people said that O'Connor should recuse herself from the case. And basically, judges can have political views, and they have preferences. But in the end, I do think that O'Connor, she and the justices that sided with Bush in the state of Florida, I think they did make the right call, because they were trying to follow the laws of the state of Florida while also trying to protect the voting rights of the people of the state overall, not just the people who lived in a handful of battleground counties in the state. But you may have a very different idea about the state, the Bush v. Gore decision, and that's completely fine. Here are the first of a couple of very important cases related to gun control that came out in the 2000s. This was a period where Second Amendment rights are being broadened, and to begin, Washington, D.C., the District of Columbia had banned handguns and had placed major restrictions on firearms storage in homes. Some would say it would make self-defense in the case of a home invasion very difficult. Having to get to your gun, get to the ammunition, and get the trigger lock off. By then it could be too late. Your home could be broken into, and you could really be in danger. And this led to a diverse group of plaintiffs, including a man named Dick Heller, a retired police officer, suing D.C. And it was a 5-4 decision, so a close decision. The majority was written by Justice Antonin Scalia, who at the time was probably the most conservative justice on the court, except perhaps for Justice Clarence Thomas. And the majority found that the Second Amendment protected firearm use beyond the well-regulated militia that is described in the Constitution in the Second Amendment. And the term regulated meant something a bit different in the 1700s than it does today. It didn't mean necessarily controlled by the government. Really, regulated meant something more like well-funded and well-trained and well-disciplined, because a lot of early militias were often very underfunded, and people often didn't have the best weapons and firearms, and they often skipped their military training and things like that. So that's another conversation, though. But they found that the Second Amendment was not just about militia service. It was about lawful personal use of firearms for self-defense, certainly in colonial and early Republic America, for hunting as well. And they said that home defense really was an intention of the Second Amendment as well, and that the right to bear arms could still be limited in some cases and places, because even in the 18th century, there were still limits on firearm use. For example, in some of the colonies, it was illegal to sell Native Americans firearms, for example. And this is going to lead to other Supreme Court cases. We are a common law, case law country, so one Supreme Court case, one court case will lead to another. It will give us things like McDonald v. Chicago in 2010, and more recently the New York State Rifle and Pistol Association v. Bruin in 2022. And as I've said before, historically across the 20th century, Americans' access to firearms has been increasingly restricted by federal, state, and local authorities, but by the late 90s, certainly after 1995, and certainly by the early 2000s, the federal government began to move in the opposite direction. There was the 1995 Lopez case mentioned before. Then there was the 2004 expiration of the 1994 assault weapons ban, and now you have DC v. Heller, and then you're going to also have McDonald v. Chicago, and then the Bruin case more recently. This is McDonald v. the City of Chicago. Chicago had passed basically an all-out handgun ban in 1982, and Otis McDonald, an elderly retiree who lived in a high-crime neighborhood in Chicago, wanted to purchase a handgun for self-defense. As a senior citizen, he needed an easy way to defend himself living in a high-crime area. McDonald was also African American as well, which that was an important consideration because in the past, in many cases, African Americans had been targeted by firearm restriction, by gun control laws. There were laws designed to keep enslaved people and then the freedmen from owning firearms in the post-Reconstruction South, for example. And McDonald and his team, they argued that Chicago's laws threatened his Second Amendment rights, his right to bear arms and defend himself, in line with the recent Heller case, and also that they were a threat to his 14th Amendment rights, his equal protection under the law. The way he defended himself was with handguns, and therefore he should be allowed to purchase a handgun. And there was a 5-4 ruling again in favor of Chicago, and the most important piece of information that comes out of this case was by Justice Samuel Alito, who was a younger justice at the time and a recent Bush appointee. And that was what was called the Heller test. The Heller test came out of the earlier DC v. Heller case, and basically what the Heller test did was it meant that gun control laws could not just be passed based on public safety concerns about regulating firearm owning, regulating firearm use, because handguns are used much more frequently in violent crimes and murders than other types of firearms. But now legislators will have to think about the fundamental rights of the American people, the Second Amendment rights, as they're trying to pass laws with public safety concerns in mind. The idea is balance the need for public safety to regulate firearm ownership and use, while at the same time also considering people's Second Amendment rights. And this is the 14th Amendment alongside the Second Amendment, and basically it's another element of federalism as well, where federal law, being the Second Amendment and the 14th Amendment, supersedes state laws. And it's also going to lead to the Bruin case of 2022. There are many landmark Supreme Court cases that are decided in the 1990s and 2000s and 2010s. I'm just going over a few that you'll need to know for the Florida Civic Literacy exam. And the last one that you'll need to know is FEC v. Citizens United. In 2008, Citizens United, a conservative nonprofit, basically a super PAC, aired a documentary and political ads against then Democratic Party candidate Hillary Clinton. This was during the primaries before Barack Obama became the Democrats' nominee and then won the 2008 election. And these videos, they were banned from being aired because of the 2002 Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act, which forbade corporations and unions from using general treasury funds for electioneering. And this was part of what was called campaign finance reform, which regulated and restricted how election campaigns could raise funds. They would have to basically raise them through what were called political action committees, or PACs, or super PACs they're sometimes called. And this was something that actually was supported by both Republicans and Democrats, including by President George W. Bush, who was the chief executive at the time. This legislation was designed to get the money out of politics, so-called, but in some ways it actually just made the problem of political corruption even worse, because these super PACs can, in many cases, take on a lot more money than a traditional election campaign could fundraise. And the Supreme Court ruled 5-4 that the federal government cannot restrict entities like Citizens United from spending, as doing so would lead to restrictions on protected speech. The First Amendment is our right to free speech, and the idea is that we are no longer restricting speech. Speech is protected unless it is calling for imminent lawless action. And that was something that was from the 1960s. Over time, across the 20th century, First Amendment rights have been significantly broadened. Freedom of expression has been significantly broadened. And this should not just pass for individuals, but for corporations and companies as well, because corporations are people are what make up these corporations. I don't think that corporations are people, in the words of a former presidential candidate, Mitt Romney, but they are made up of individuals, and people want to hear what these corporations have to say, even if maybe what they're saying is not correct, or even if it's paid for by other corporations. People have a right to hear and learn about things. This is part of the First Amendment as well, not only your right to speak, but your right to hear. And the majority opinion was actually delivered by Justice Anthony Kennedy, who was one of the more liberal justices on the court. He sided in favor of freedom of expression and the First Amendment, even if it meant supporting a conservative organization, Citizens United. And the dissenting opinion was that corporations were not people and thus did not have the same protections, First Amendment protections, as individuals. I'm going to need a couple of slides here to close out this video and to close out my AMH 2020 course. And these slides cover topics that I'd like to explore further in the future as we move further into the future and as we cover more 21st century history. So there's a distinct rise of populism that occurs in America in the 2010s. And I've argued before that this is driven in large part by a dissatisfaction with neoliberal economics and neoconservative foreign policy. And it's also driven by continuing social mistrust, increases in social mistrust, and an increasing decline in trust in institutions as well. Not just political parties, but mainstream media, academia, higher education, law enforcement, the military. This will lead to a surge in populism, a lot like what happens in the late 1800s. In economics, probably is the biggest driver, this dissatisfaction with neoliberal economics in a globalized economy. You see this with the Tea Party movement that rises in the late 2000s. It was a conservative organization, but really very suspicious of both parties and bailouts that were being given to banks and being given to automakers that were significant interventions in the economy. They're not limited government, as many conservatives support. The Tea Party movement sort of came and went, though, in the early 2010s. The Occupy Wall Street movement was a left-wing populist movement that began to rise in about 2011, and they were also upset about some of the same things. Banks getting bailed out, big corporations getting bailed out while everyday Americans are losing their homes. They were very concerned with wealth disparities, the 1% versus the 99%. That language has been around for a long time in American history, but it came back into major popularity and back into the cultural zeitgeist in the early 2010s because of the 2008 financial crisis and how the U.S. government and how both political parties handled the issue, whether it was the Bush administration or the Obama administration. And these movements, I would argue, and I think others would agree with me, they morphed over time into supporting political parties and political candidacies. The Occupy Wall Street movement, a left-wing populist movement, morphed into the support for Bernie Sanders, the 2016, one of the 2016 and even 2020 Democratic Party candidates for president. He didn't make it past the primaries, although he had significant grassroots support, organic support, particularly from younger voters. He was not able to become the nominee for the Democratic Party in the 2016 or the 2020 election. And people talk about conspiracy theories. They'll talk about how Bernie Sanders was not left-wing enough for the Democratic Party, and others will say that he was too left-wing, and that he would have broken down the Democratic Party from its more left-leaning younger voters and some of the older, more business-minded Democrats. There are some truth to some of those things. Also, issues related to race relations and things like that were very tense in the 2010s and even into the early 2020s. There's a variety of reasons for why that is, which I'll probably go over when I make a future version of this video. But probably the most mundane reason that Bernie Sanders never became the nominee for the Democratic Party, although he had considerable support, was the superdelegate system. The Democratic Party, in some ways, actually conducts their primaries in a very undemocratic way. And what they really try to do in their primaries is they try to choose what they think is going to be the most electable candidate, who will then hopefully go on and win in the general election. They thought it was going to be Hillary Clinton in 2016. It didn't work out in 2016. It did work out with Joe Biden in 2020, but that basically meant that Sanders was seen as being not electable enough, and therefore he some would say was denied the opportunity to become the frontrunner for the Democrats and never had a shot at being president. On the Republican side, you have the rise of Donald Trump, one of only two presidents to serve non-consecutive terms, the other being Grover Cleveland in the late 1800s. And the Republican Party conducts their primaries differently. The candidate that gets the most votes in the primaries becomes the front runner and will then run for president. And in some ways, this is a more democratic way of doing things, but it can lead to, in some cases, the people who vote in the primaries tend to be the most die-hard, most politically active people. They often don't represent your typical voter. So that often leads to the base comes out for the primaries and the general election, but then for the general election, it's the less committed voters. So, this leads to more radical candidates, like candidate Trump becoming the nominee in 2016. And there's been a lot of discussion about Trump's rhetoric, whether it's dog whistles, whether it's overt signaling to certain groups in American society. But he did recognize the anger and discontent that many Americans were feeling in the mid-2010s at the fact that the economy was very slow to dig its way out of the 2008 recession. Much of the recovery was confined to coastal cities, where the hipsters were. Areas that, while there were good jobs in tech, were very expensive to live in. And the talk of making America great again, of getting the economy going, of getting America out of these long and expensive and bloody foreign wars and the war on terror, dealing with situations related to immigration. Some have, of course, criticized those stances in immigration. Those appealed to a lot of American voters who were fed up with the system. Again, it's a rise of populism on the right and a rise of populism on the left. And the way Trump spoke and the way the Republican Party operated, they actually did a better job integrating populism into their party's messaging. A better job, I think, than the Democrats have done thus far. But that could change in the future. The Democrats could change how they do their primaries. They could look at younger candidates that support more populistic issues. They may be doing that. It's hard to say for sure what the future holds. And again, you may agree or disagree with me. I'm not endorsing any candidate or political party here. I'm just trying to note trends in politics that have been developing for a long period of time. And the final thing I'll say about politics is I think politics are pretty volatile in the 2010s and in the 2020s because we're coming to an end, I think, of the sixth party system. It's just the political parties are so firmly entrenched by this point in American history. It's probably going to take a longer period of de-alignment for a new seventh party system to emerge. There was a de-alignment period between the fifth and the sixth party system that lasted from about the mid 1960s with the 64 election and Barry Goldwater that was pretty much finished by 1980. You might see a much longer de-alignment between the sixth party system, which is definitely collapsing now as of 2025, and the seventh party system, which perhaps will emerge sometime in the near future. Concluding slides 2, economic change. This slide draws data from interdisciplinary set of sources. I looked at the work of David Graeber, an anthropologist. He's done some very, very good work. He passed away recently, so I guess he's the late David Graeber. And he wrote a book called BS Jobs. I'm not going to say the full title because this is YouTube, but basically Graeber argued that in a world with automation and with the technology we have today, a lot of work, especially white-collar work, is BS. It's not really adding value to the economy. And he breaks down these BS jobs that are in white-collar work. There's the flunkies that are there to make people feel better and feel important, but their jobs largely could be done by automation. That includes receptionists and doormen, for example, or door people if we want to be more gender neutral. The second group that Graeber identifies are the duct tapers, and they are people that basically fix problems within their organizations. And essentially they're fixing problems that are made by other employees, and they're fixing problems that are made by the incompetence of fellow employees or by upper management. And basically, if everybody just did their jobs properly, there wouldn't really be a need for these duct tapers. The third section are the box tickers, and these are people that companies feel they have to hire in order to look like they're a serious company, like they're productive, like they're egalitarian, like they're supporting the right kind of causes. And this is a lot of people who report on the company, especially in-house, journalists who, do PR work. A lot of that work could be done in some cases, certainly by 2025, by AI, and a lot of corporate and HR people who kind of their main job is compliance. Their work is just box ticking. They're supposed to have X number of these people involved in this type of work, and therefore we have to have them. Otherwise, we're not a real corporation that people would want to invest in. The fourth category, a more controversial category, are the goons, and they're there who basically to protect the company, or in some cases to hurt anyone who's a threat to the company. And basically the only reason you have goons is because everybody else has goons. And this includes corporate lawyers. Corporations employ armies of lawyers to protect them from getting sued or to sue other companies. And lobbyists are also in this group as well, though I think lobbyists are a little bit different. Lobbyists advocate for certain types of laws, and in some cases actually help write legislation that benefits corporations, in some cases corporations over the American people. And the last group are the taskmasters, and these are basically middle management, and in some ways you might even argue that even the CEOs of companies are taskmasters, and AI in some cases, could do their job better, could better manage a company, could better allocate resources and direct the focus of a company far better than a flawed human being ever could. So these are the bullshit, or BS jobs that Graeber talks about. And these jobs arise, as a historian I can tell you, they arise in some ways from the associative state. Which developed back in the times of Herbert Hoover, capitalism and the government being mixed together through corporations in some cases doing the work of the government to get around constitutional concerns. And the idea is you have people in America who are what we would call dependent classes who survive off of transfer payments, what are called social safety nets, social welfare, safety nets that expanded from the 1930s really through the 60s and 70s, then began to be eroded and dissolved from the 1980s into the 21st century. But you also have people that are in management and who often don't really do a lot of real work that adds value to the country, yet they're receiving salaries. Some might call this a form of corporate welfare, essentially, where you're kind of making up jobs for people to do so they won't be unemployed. But all of this is going to be strongly disrupted by AI in the future. A lot of these jobs are just simply going to be eliminated as companies look to cut their biggest cost, which is labor costs. And I'm certainly not advocating that companies do this. I don't want to see people be unemployed. But at the same time, I don't want to be technophobic either. And not only will AI eliminate a lot of these jobs, but jobs and job titles that seem like they were elite in the past, that they were done by white collar, college educated, upper middle class people, what mid-century Americans would have called the technocracy, those jobs are going to lose their elite status. They're not going to be seen as being respectable anymore. They're not going to be seen as being desirable anymore. Like, when I grow up, I want to be a manager. I mean, most young children don't say that, but the idea is, your parents might encourage you to get into management because the paycheck is good, the social respectability is good, but that's going to go away in the future as those jobs become less stable and they pay less. And I think it's already happening with, the focus on getting people into blue collar work and into the trades again. That's a trend that's been baking for a long time. I think it's going to accelerate thanks to AI. It's technological innovation and disruption. We've been seeing this throughout AMH 2020, and you see it throughout world history. And then it's also what is called genteel poverty. These are people that came from upper middle class families. They went to good schools. They went on to university. They have the language. They have the cultural coding of upper middle class people, but they're not making upper middle class wages. And they don't have upper middle class job security. In some cases, they're actually living more like low income or working class people, although they're not doing blue collar work. Whereas there are many blue collar people that they are actually in some cases doing very well because there were some incorrect predictions that were made about what jobs would disappear and what jobs would be automated. There has been a lot of automation, which has eliminated a lot of blue collar jobs, but automation and AI are now eliminating a lot of white collar jobs. And the skilled blue collar jobs, those jobs are harder to automate because our AI and computing technology has exploded since the end of World War II, but our robotics and engineering technology simply has not. That's why we have really powerful phones and computers, more powerful than even things you see in retrofuturistic shows, but we don't have flying cars, basically. And this is another trend that I think about as well when I teach AMH 2020. And it's relevant to all of history, but it's certainly relevant to AMH 2020, and it's social lag or cultural lag. This is a term that was used by William F. Ogburn in 1922, and basically it means that material culture changes much faster than non-material culture. The objects that you use, your living situation, they will change much more quickly than the ideas you have about people and about society. And this, makes a lot of sense. A lot of stuff in social science, it's very intuitive and very obvious points, but using academic language to explain these things that I think everybody sort of knows on a very deep level. And I'll give you an example of social lag in American history. From 1865 to 1945, America's material existence changed significantly as a result of the Gilded Age Industrial Revolution, the integration of the American West, the emergence of the American Empire and the global trade that came with it, and then the two world wars. Americans' standard of living drastically increased and changed overall for the better in this period. And think about how someone lived at 1865 at the end of the Civil War versus how someone lived at 1945, the end of World War II. These are two events that were 80 years apart, 1865 to 1945, and then, of course, 1945 to the present. Now, as an American living in 2025, look back at this period in American history. Do the people living in 1945 have more in common with us today, or do they have more in common with the people in 1865, 80 years before? And I like to use military history examples because military affairs are an area where technology changes very, very rapidly, and people have to be a lot more embracing of new technology, because if you don't embrace new technology in warfare, you're going to die or you're going to get other people killed. So a soldier in World War II, he has access to automatic weapons. He knows about internal combustion engines. They power his Jeep. They power his tank. They power his aircraft. Yes, he has aircraft. He has powered flight. He has the ability to cruise through the sky like a bird on fixed wings. If he is wounded, he has access to antiseptics to prevent spread of infection. He has antibiotics, using other life forms to protect him from wounds. While he's convalescing in the hospital, not only can he write letters home to his family like the Civil War soldier could do, he can listen to the radio, he can listen to the president on the radio, he can watch movies and newsreels that are set up in the hospital. He has mass media and he has mass marketing. When he goes home, he will go home to a house that has electricity and indoor plumbing, especially if it's a new, post 45 new build. He can purchase an automobile. He has a good job. And in his own lifetime, he's going to see nuclear bombs, the splitting of the atom. He's going to see a man landed on the moon as well. And think about the soldier of the present, who has all of those things, but also has automation and even things like nanotechnology. That's something that the U.S. military is experimenting with the future force warrior. And you might say that the soldier of World War II in many ways has more in common with the soldier of the present than he does with his grandfather who was in the Civil War, who doesn't have internal combustion engines, doesn't have antibiotics, doesn't even really know fully about germ theory. Those ideas were being explored in the 1860s and 1870s, who uses a single-shot black powder rifled musket rather than a M1 Garand or a machine gun. Technically, they had the Gatling gun, which was an early machine gun in the Civil War. But here's the thing. While materially speaking, the World War II soldier is more like us than he is the Civil War soldier, I think the World War II soldiers thinking about the world and about ideas and gender relations, ideas about race, ideas about ethnicity, are more like those of the Civil War soldier. And that's because material culture changes much more quickly than non-material culture, social views, political views, views about race, gender, ethnicity. And I'm not picking on the World War II soldier for thinking like a Civil War soldier. I'm certainly not doing that. As a historian, I have an immense respect for the challenges people in the past went through, and they don't have that benefit of hindsight the way I do as a historian. But material existence has changed quite a bit less from 1945 to the present. Yes, we do have things like AI now, AI LLMs, and we have computers in our back pockets that are better than the computers that were used by Neil Armstrong and his crew during the moon landing. But as I said, we don't have flying cars, or at least not the way they do in the Jetsons, where everybody has one, and it's like taking a regular passenger vehicle. Our engineering technology and our knowledge of physics has not kept up with our computing knowledge. Here's my obligatory concluding slide. It's about the rise of LLMs. We've had artificial intelligence for a long time before 2022 when ChatGPT by OpenAI first went live. We had AI chess programs like Deep Blue, for decades. There was the chatbot made by Microsoft, Tay AI, I think was what her name was. She basically was a chatbot that used the vernacular of a teenage girl, from what I remember. This is back in about 2016 or so. But artificial intelligence technology, like computing technology, it has more like exponential, explosive growth, whereas other types of technological innovation tend to be more linear. And it's certainly going to be extremely disruptive, as I've noted before. I think areas where we're lagging a bit are AI safety. How do we train these AI LLMs to act in the most moral manner possible? It's actually pretty easy to crack their coding to make them hallucinate. And then integration with robotics is an area where we're lagging behind. And while we have some sophisticated robotics, we don't have androids like from Star Trek, and thankfully we don't have like the T-800 from Terminator. And of course, computing technology has grown much more quickly than our engineering technology. This is due to a variety of factors, just the nature of computing and chip technology. It's going to be exponential in how improvements are made. But with engineering technology, there are just simple physics impasses and innovation dead ends that just slow things down. And perhaps AI, properly trained, can help us overcome these roadblocks. It can help us have those flying cars. Or it might just continue to eliminate low to mid-level white-collar and data entry type jobs, which can be done much more quickly and with fewer errors than by human workers, and certainly can be done for much less money. Although there are significant impacts, climatological impacts, and impacts on local communities when these, data centers are being built. And so, what is the best plan for future workers? Because people often ask me as a historian what kind of advice I have about the future, and it's always hard for me to answer because I study the past to try to get an idea of what the future might look like, but I don't want to, say the wrong thing and lead somebody down the wrong path. And so I would advise people, find a job that AI cannot do, or at least not yet. And if you can't do that, find a job that people would not trust AI to do on its own, or a job that AI either cannot be trusted to do on its own, or that it's not legally allowed to do without significant human oversight. And then once you find a job where you're integrated with AI, learn how to use these AI LLMs and become as productive as possible. Really, the buck stops with you. Make sure that you know how to train the AI, how to prompt it really well, and basically be the best AI user of all the people you work with. And some examples of this I think you'll see in healthcare, because while doctors and nurses and healthcare professionals will say that they don't use AI, they are. I've talked to people in the healthcare who work in the healthcare world, and they're using it. They don't want their patients to know they're using it, but they're using it. Within the field of engineering, again, using AI to help you build things and make plans, but make sure that what you're doing with AI is better than what AI does on its own. The human side of education, AI has the ability to, scan and scrape the entire internet to make historical lectures, but make sure you can do it better and bring human intuition into your analysis, something that AI can't do. I mean, Sam Altman of ChatGPT says that ChatGPT can think and research at the doctoral level, and I don't think it's there yet. It doesn't mean it won't get there in the future, but make sure you're on the human side of education. You leverage your humanity in education, and you'll do well while using AI. And then I would say skilled trades, skilled blue-collar work that cannot be easily automated, either because the task is too sophisticated that you don't have a robot that can just do this job, or because people won't trust a robot or AI to do the job. I've talked with people in the trades, And they mention things like low voltage electricians. There's a big demand for low voltage electricians right now, that it's less dangerous than high voltage electricians, but it's much more sophisticated, the kind of work you're doing. Just, the bar is higher because it's less dangerous. High voltage electrician work could be done by AI and robots that, if they get electrocuted, it's not as big of a deal if a human being gets electrocuted. But something that requires a lot more sophistication, that's something that you want to work in yourself. And I'm not saying that if you're a high voltage electrician, you're not sophisticated compared to low voltage. Certainly not. I'm noticing, what areas seem to be growing the fastest. I would advise people to use a lot more caution if you're pursuing jobs and anything communications related, whether it's writing articles, whether it's content creation on a site like YouTube. There's so much AI content, or AI slop as it's called right now. If you're going to do something like that, one, know that there's a lot of other people doing it. There's a immense amount of competition, but make sure you can do it in a way that feels more genuine and feels more authentic. You're never going to be able to research as quickly or scrape as much information and data as an AI can, but make sure that you are human. Bring that human element, that human authenticity. There are people online who are very right to say this, but they say that authenticity will be the currency of the future, especially as we become perhaps more of an attention economy where everybody's trying to vie for your attention, to make you watch ads, to make you watch influencers, to make you watch all kinds of content. Do it in a way that feels human, that feels authentic, if you're going to go down that route. The same thing would go with journalism. I see all these articles and I look at them and I'm like, I think this was written by AI. So, if you're going to use AI to write journal articles or, journalism, news articles, make it sound like it was written by a human, which means, again, AI work and training. Same thing with law. AI will be able to scrape the entire a nation's entire set of laws, thousands and thousands of volumes of information, far more quickly than even a team of lawyers and paralegals could. The thing is, though, AI lawyers seem to make a lot of mistakes. This is where AI safety and ethics come in. They seem to make up laws and make up cases that never actually happened in order to win arguments and things like that. So if you're going to go in law, make sure you know how to use AI. Make sure that you're smarter and more ethical than the AI is. And the last area where I would urge more caution is any kind of tech jobs. There's a lot of tech layoffs going on in the early 2020s. In some ways, I think this is post-COVID hangover. People are getting laid off. They were hired in 2020, 2021, 2022, during the period of lower interest rates, during the period of a lot of tech investments, during the period when everybody told that working from home was the new normal. And now, as of 2024, 2025, those jobs are being eliminated. Some of those jobs may not have even been necessary to begin with. They may have been those so-called BS jobs. I would say if you're going to try to work in tech, where if you can get a job, the salary is quite good, but it's going to be very competitive and very up and down. I would say, try to make sure that you know coding. Learn to code, as people used to joke in the late 2010s. But even AI is learning how to code, but humans will still code better than AI can, at least as of now. It's just they do it more slowly. So learn how to use AI for coding, but actually know coding. Don't just do vibe coding where you tell the AI what to do. That's going to lead to more problems and mistakes. AI can be very assistive in a variety of tasks, but as of now, it still needs human closers for oversight, liability, and direction. So if you're going to work in an industry where there's going to be AI disruption, make sure that you can be a closer. Make sure that you're in oversight, you're in liability, or you're offering it direction.